Hey everybody, this little bottle contains an absolute miracle. It'll help you start your day off feeling great and with a ton of energy, even if you've had a couple of drinks the night before. zbiotics.com/reach, you'll get 15% off. And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live on a special event. We've not done one of these ever before. We're going to replay some of our favorite episodes related to the McGonigal Affair. That's, I'll introduce you to the little guy sitting next to me a little later on who's interjecting in the show tonight. Shh, Boomer, shh. All right, so we're going to do the McGonigal Affair tonight. That is a marathon coverage of all our shows up until now. It'll feature Craig Unger, journalist Jeff Stein of Spy Talk, plus our intelligence analyst Eric Garland will be in one of those shows. Many of them you've seen, but it's good to recap them because there's a lot of information that you might have missed as we look at the entire investigation related to... You're killing me here, Boomer. I mean, really. Okay, so... apologies for that. I will tell you that we will add throughout the night a lot of previously unreported stuff that we've got, that we've managed to assemble. Things like Sheldon Whitehouse talking to the former FBI director. You know what? I am going to give up because I can't get through the segment with little Boomer going, so cute. I will introduce you to him in a bit, I promise. I'll tell you what, we'll hit the first break, then we'll come back after the first break with the first episode that we were replaying, which features Craig Unger. It goes back through the 22-year history of Charlie McGonigal. And that's all I got for you until I've cleared up little guy's noisiness. So we'll see you after this. Hey everybody, it's Zev from Narrative. This is the most romantic week of the year. And you know what that means? Dinners, dates, drinks, and more. And sometimes those celebrations can leave you feeling a little worse for wear the next morning, if you know what I mean. Well, I have discovered an absolutely brilliant solution for that. It's called Z-Biotics. It's a pre-alcohol probiotic, and it's a miracle formula that allows you to have a few drinks at night without getting those awful post-drinking blues the next day. No need to worry about safety. It's all natural and FDA compliant. You can get Z-Biotics for 15% off your first order with my code REACH, R-E-A-C-H. I recommend getting the 6-pack. That's what I got, and it's a great deal, and you'll have a couple of extra to share with your friends. Click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen right now and use code REACH, R-E-A-C-H, at checkout. Go to zbiotics.com/reach and get 15% off, plus 100% money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied. Make this date night one even Cupid would be proud of. Get some Z-Biotics today so you can still feel the love tomorrow. I like that. And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live on a Wednesday night. Another special report tonight. We're going to be taking a look at the mole inside the FBI. Charles McGonigal, what exactly was he up to in the last 25 years while he was at the FBI? We're subtitling this, How Putin Got His Inside Man. Plus, we'll have all the news on Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos, and all the latest from Ukraine coming up. And I'm also thrilled to announce our very special friend, Craig Unger, the author of American Compromise, is here. Hi, Craig. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Good to see you, Zev.
Likewise, it's been a while. I'm excited to have you here because you have probably the greatest insight of the workings of the mob inside New York, and particularly as it involves Donald Trump and some of the people that the former counterintelligence head of the New York office would have been investigating. I'm excited to hear your take about what might not have been investigated if Russians did, in fact, have a mole inside the FBI. Do you think he was as much that as I'm saying he is, a real long-time mole?
It's quite possible, and you have to wonder whether or not McGonigal was responsible for the leaks in the weeks just before the election. He was hired, I believe, on October 4th to that position in 2016, just about exactly a month before the election. And there were a fair number of leaks there that forced James Comey's hands, and he made that announcement 8 days before the election that they were back investigating Hillary. So it's quite possible McGonigal was involved. I don't know. But it also raises a larger question. There's so many things about which one Trump should have been investigated. And you have to wonder, why didn't the FBI go there?
You have to wonder why. And there's a long list of investigations that McGonigal was involved in, and we'll go through them tonight, which didn't ever reach sort of a satisfactory conclusion. Some of them, like TWA 800, we just don't know what happened. In other cases, you had people wrongly accused, but we never found out what really was the main cause of these crimes or the criminals involved in these crimes. So we'll go through all of that. Plus, I've been able to find out a lot about what McGonigal was involved with in Albania. And let me tell you, it's unseemly stuff. It all goes back to Vladimir Putin and Oleg Deripaska, two names we know quite well. And we'll cover all of that as we go through the hour. But I should get everyone caught up on the news, so let's do that first. And topping the news tonight, the United States will be sending its Abrams M1 tanks to Ukraine, and Germany says it will approve sending its Leopard tanks. Joe Biden made the announcement today at the White House.
The United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives.
What that really means is the balance of power is really going to shift on the Ukrainian battlefield, because Russia really does not have the firepower to fight against these kinds of tanks with the armor that these tanks have. In other news, it's hard to believe, but apparently Marjorie Taylor Greene believes she can be the vice president to another Trump presidency. Here's what NBC reported this morning.
Vice President Marjorie Taylor Greene, according to NBC News exclusive, reporting the controversial Georgia Congresswoman is setting her sights on just that, a presidential ticket, hoping to team up with former President Donald Trump as his VP in 2024. Former Trump aide Steve Bannon, who spoke to Greene about the job, told NBC News she, quote, sees herself on the short list.
Of course, we're a long way away from him actually making a short list and vetting candidates. He obviously really likes Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is somebody who has immense ambition, as Steve Bannon said to me. He paraphrased an old Washington saw saying every time she looks in the mirror, she sees a president staring back at her. The vice presidency might be the fastest route to do that.
Meanwhile, a lawyer for the former vice president, Mike Pence, says documents, classified documents, were discovered at the Indiana home of the former vice president, and a small number of them have now been returned to the National Archives. It's unclear if he'll be getting his own special counsel. And in other news, after our reporting last week about the financial worries around George Santos's campaign financing, it seems that he's amended some of his campaign financing reports that we said might be illegal last week. Now he says that it was not a personal loan that he funded his campaign with, but rather money that came from somewhere else. Now, where did it come from? He doesn't say, although we did outline last week in our reporting, which seems to have got a lot of people's attention, that the financing did come from unusual characters who funding his campaign. That is the news. Coming up, another big story that the mainstream news, has neglected to follow up on. We're not going to do the same thing tonight. Inside the FBI, was there a mole for the Russians?
Hey, it's Zev from Narrative. I'm excited to announce the launch of my new original series, Spy Murdoch. This is an epic story of Rupert Murdoch as an intelligence asset, and it's all 100% true. Spy Murdoch will premiere in February on Narrative's Patreon feed and Narrative's new premium YouTube channel. Now, to join either of those services, you can either head over to patreon.com/narrative and sign up there, or to join our new YouTube premium channel, just look for the join button underneath the screen when you're watching on YouTube. This is brand new content with bombshell revelations that have never been revealed before about the iconic Murdoch. We will explain, amongst many other things, how Fox News gained such a foothold in the United States. For a limited time, we're offering access to all our premium content for just $5 a month. Prices will go up, so lock in today. You'll have a front row seat as I unravel the secrets of Rupert Murdoch for the first time. Don't miss this opportunity to be among the first to learn these brand new details and watch this narrative original series with me. It'll change the way you view history and your place in it. That's Spy Murdoch, beginning in February on Narrative.
Back live now with Craig Unger, the author of American Compromise. Craig, take us back to that moment, because that was a good place to start. James Comey had to hire somebody new for counterintelligence agent in charge. He chose Charles McGonigal. Tell us a little bit more, if you can, about what Comey was doing with those investigations, with the Wiener emails.
We're getting down to the last 4 weeks before the presidential election, and there was a lot of internal stuff going on within the FBI. I don't think nearly enough attention's been paid to that. To me, there was pretty clearly a Rudy Giuliani wing of the FBI. And now we see Rudy, of course, as a cartoon character, and he looks ridiculous with his dyed hair dripping down his face, and he's completely discredited. Back then, he wasn't, not so much. He was still a bit of the America's a mayor attached to him. I think the position McGonigal got of counterintelligence is extremely important. And one of the big flaws the FBI has made, and Robert Mueller and the Mueller probe as well, is that these investigations were treated as criminal rather than counterintelligence. And when you're dealing with people like Oleg Deripaska, it's really got to be counterintelligence. National security should be the first priority, not the last. And it also raises questions about how they were treating Donald Trump, too, because as I reported in my previous book, House of Trump, House of Putin, the Russian mafia had been laundering millions and millions of dollars through Trump real estate. And that all went by the wayside. Forgot about it. No one was ever prosecuted on it. And it wasn't even raised much by the mainstream media at all, not to mention the FBI.
The time that Charles McGonigal spent in the FBI really tracks the whole emergence of the Russian mob in New York and also the United States. We had the Cosa Nostra there before that, and then the Russian mob sort of came in with the refuseniks maybe amongst them. And then with that mob emerging, there was new leadership in the FBI and in New York City, and that leadership was essentially Rudy Giuliani. He was the guy in charge, at least in the mayor's office, but before that at the attorney general's office, for policing this change that happened from the Cosa Nostra into the more Russian-controlled New York mob scene. He had a very good collaborator because James Kallstrom was the head of the New York City FBI field office. And we know that Kallstrom and Rudy had a long history of working together, even after they both left their respective offices. They worked as part of a consultancy together. They traveled the world providing services to different people. And they also always kept an open ear to what was going on in the FBI field office by being involved in the FBI union, which is where they were able to get a lot of influence and get a lot of information. And of course, at the same time as all this was happening, Louis Freeh, another close collaborator of Rudy Giuliani, was the FBI director. So you really had the three very important positions, especially in New York City, that really had a way of controlling who was going to be the top crime guy, who was going to be the bottom crime guy. And it seems that Charles McGonigal, way back in 1996, began his career as an officer in that mob world, really looking at Russian counterintelligence in New York City. A long time that he must be familiar with a lot of the same players who are still there today.
And Kallstrom was very close to Trump as well. I've seen outtakes of him on video explaining his relationship with Trump. I quote him in my last book, American Compromise, and he said that Trump, who was famously cheap about giving to charities back in the 70s, he gave $1.3 million from his favorite charity. Kallstrom said Trump would call him at least once a week for a 40-year period. That's a real friendship. I don't know how many friends you speak to every single week for 40 years.
Not that many, actually.
Everyone was cracking down on this. When I first got into investigating the money laundering going through Trump Tower of the Russian mafia money, to be honest, I got FBI files. And I think if I can get FBI files, the FBI should have been able to get them too.
So when did the mob infiltration and Trump sort of coincide? What years are we talking about here?
I go back all the way back to the 1980s. In 1984, a guy named David Bogadin, who was a Russian mobster, and according to FBI files, and he went to Trump Tower. Trump Tower just opened the previous year, so it was this glamorous-looking new building. And Bogadin was a mobster. He personally met with Trump. He had, I believe it was $6 million in cash. And he said, I'll take 5 condos.
And a lot of money back then in the 1980s.
They're 15 million today or
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
And Trump, or part of the problem is very hard to prosecute money laundering because you have to prove that Trump, the recipient, knew it came from illicit sources. But Trump, of course, doesn't ask questions. He doesn't say, oh, where did you get that money? Was it from your prostitution ring? No, he just takes the money and doesn't ask questions. And this kind of thing happened with 1,500 condos that Trump sold under conditions that count for money laundering. That is, to an anonymous owner of a limited liability corporation and all cash purchases without any bank financing whatsoever. That's 1,300 condos. And it's rare for a Trump condo to go for under $1 million.
So by 1996, and there must have been, do you know how many towers he'd built by 1996? Was that post-bankruptcy?
Well, so many bankruptcies, it's hard to keep track.
Yeah.
But he was still on the ropes from his seas in Atlantic City. And the Russian mob came to his aid again and again in bailing him out. In 2002, you may recall, Felix Sater and his company, Bayrock Group, moved into Trump Tower. They took their offices on the 24th floor, just 1 or 2 floors below Trump's personal office. And they started making deals with him. And they said, look, you don't have to put up a dime. We will put up all the funding. You don't have to develop the skyscrapers. We'll do the development. We just want to borrow your name. And for that, we'll give you, I think it was 18 to 25% of the profits on a franchise deal for which he had to do nothing. So it was an incredibly lucrative deal for Trump, and it happened again and again. And these people who ran Bayrock were affiliated with the Russian mafia and or Russian intelligence. And it goes way, way back.
I think as well in the 1990s, he got involved in World Resorts International, which is a murky part of the Trump history, but it also involves a lot of mob figures, if I remember correctly. So as he was emerging from that bankruptcy, sort of landed on his feet with World Resorts. And then you're right, he developed this very lucrative relationship with Felix. And that's where there was the first discussion of a Trump Tower in Moscow, which of course was the bedrock of a lot of what people thought was going to be the Mueller investigation, was that potential tower in Moscow. So it really are saying here, what I suspected might be true, is that Charles McGonigal's career may have started in the 1990s or mid-1990s, tracking the Russian mob in New York City. It's almost impossible for him to have missed Donald Trump in that time, because Donald Trump was so intricately involved with the mob at that time.
You have to almost aggressively look the other way. And if you're being paid large sums by Oleg Deripaska, you probably are going to look the other way. And Deripaska is not just another oligarch. He's very close to Putin. He controls the aluminum industry, which is a really vital strategic resource. Airplanes are made out of aluminum. So if aluminum factories in Ukraine, that means they're at the mercy of a pal of Vladimir Putin. So the strategic resources are essential. And Deripaska, of all the oligarchs, was always front and center, leading the way for Putin. And he was the guy behind Paul Manafort. And if you go back you realize that when Putin first tried to take over Ukraine, he was trying to do it not militarily, but by bribing people through the inside, through taking over inside through soft power. And Deripaska was one of the key weapons he was using.
Absolutely. And Deripaska and Manafort and a guy named Kilimnik, Konstantin Kilimnik, who later was named by the US Treasury Department as an actual Russian spy working for the GRU. They were a team, Kilimnik and Manafort, in Ukraine to try and destabilize the government in Ukraine for Oleg Deripaska. That's a really part of the record now. There's no disputing that. So you're right about Deripaska having a long reach in the more recent years. But just staying back a little bit, if we could, on that period of times in the 1990s and before that, James Kallstrom, if I remember correctly, and you might have more information on this than I do, was the guy who used to wiretap all the Cosa Nostra mob dons at the time, because they'd just gotten all this fancy technology which allowed them to wiretap a lot of the dons. And that is one of the reasons the Cosa Nostra started to fall apart, was because of all these successful indictments of them based on these wiretappings. And this, in fact, led to wasn't there a commission around the mob or something like that in the 90s that I think he was involved in as well, that he spearheaded. Kallstrom was to a large extent credited with the beginning of the end of the Cosa Nostra's reign in New York, and Rudy Giuliani as well. But really what they were doing was giving cover for the Russians to move in.
The Russian infiltration began, really, I go all the way back to 1980 when you look at Trump's very first commercial success. And it was actually a genuine success. He had very few real successes. But when he built the Hyatt Grand Hotel in 1980, he made a fortune off of it. And he had to buy his TV sets, like every hotel. It needed hundreds of television sets. And he bought it from a store called the Joy Ludd Electronics Store. And Joy Ludd happened to be a KGB front. And one of the owners was a man named Semyon Kislin, who was close to none other than Rudy Giuliani and remained so until this day, more than 40 years later. And he was one of the very first to approach Trump in selling those TV sets. One of my sources was a former KGB major named Yuri Shvets, and Yuri was telling me that Kislin was known as a spotter agent. He was supposed to spot new assets that the KGB should recruit. And this was his act of bringing Donald Trump into the fold.
Yeah, you could see how Donald Trump would have been an attractive figure for the KGB to groom. Not only was he interested in money, that must make him an easy target, an easy mark, but also his outward appearance would have been so appealing to them, the sort of faux glam, this incredible ostentatious lifestyle, that would have appealed to the Russians as an easy target. And in fact, he was. It was back then that he took his first trip to Moscow in the late 1980s, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And Yuri was saying, if you want to recruit someone, you want to know, are they easily flattered? Do they like women? Do they like money?
Yeah, easy mark for them, for sure. I just want to underline for people why we're spending so much time talking about this guy that maybe they haven't heard too much about it before, Mr. Charles McGonigal. But the reason he's made the news, and it's pretty stunning, that an FBI executive, a guy who's in charge of counterintelligence at the biggest office in the FBI, the New York City field office, is indicted not only once, but twice on the same day. He was indicted in New York by the SDNY for working for Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska and laundering a large amount of money for his work. Deripaska sanctioned. An FBI officer of his standing, even a retired one, should know that it was a bad form to try and work for Deripaska, and any money that he was receiving would be considered completely illegal and would be contravening the sanctions, which is what he was charged with. But at the same time, he was also charged in DC for something that happened while he was still in the FBI, because the Deripaska stuff was only after he retired from the FBI. But while he was at the FBI, he apparently took a $225,000 bribe from an Albanian businessman. But it had to do with mostly Albanian politics. But what it tells me is that the guy was open to bribery while working in the New York field office as the head of counterintelligence, at the same time that he was investigating people like Oleg Deripaska, at the same time as he was investigating Trump Russia, as he was investigating the biggest attack on American democracy ever. Charles McGonigal was pocketing at least one bribe from this Albanian businessman. You might believe that there's other bribes too. It's quite stunning to think that he was placed in that position by James Comey at the time, because he must have been suspicious around his loyalty and his integrity.
Absolutely. And it's hard to believe that $225,000 is the only money that changed hands. If that's what came from Deripaska, it's a small price to pay when you're facing sanctions.
That came from the Albanian prime minister. And the Deripaska amount, I think it was a fair amount of $40,000 a month that he was getting in his retirement, which is pretty good. What do you get for $40,000 a month? You must have to be, he needs to be spending that money on something, presumably on making sure that Deripaska doesn't get into any more trouble, or that sanctions get lifted, or I don't know what he was doing. But certainly Deripaska was still very involved in trying to get his sanctions lifted at the time when that particular bit of action was. But the stuff that irks me the most is in 2016, while we were in the middle of this incredible attack, while we were in the middle of Donald Trump coming the president of the United States, potentially as a plant for the Russians, here was a guy who was willing to accept large amounts of money from Eastern European countries to do their bidding. That tells me that maybe investigation into Donald Trump was completely bungled, or if not bungled, never was allowed to really succeed.
No, I think the FBI has completely fallen down on this. I'd love to know what Frank Fickluz has to say about it. I know that McGonigal reported to him at some point, and I think he's expressed shock at the revelations.
I went and dug up Charles McGonigal's 2016. This is James Comey announcing that he's got a new special agent in charge of the counterintelligence division for the New York field office. And it says McGonigal most recently served as the section chief of the Cyber Counterintelligence Coordination section at FBI headquarters. Mr. McGonigal entered on duty with the FBI in 1996. He was first assigned to the New York field office, where he worked Russian foreign counterintelligence and organized crime matters. During his tenure in New York, Mr. McGonigal worked on the TWA Flight 800 investigation and was also assigned to the task force investigating the Wen Ho Lee investigation. We can go to that one in a bit. He also investigated the 1998 terrorist bombings in the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, and investigated the September 11th terror attacks. Now, that's a list of bold headlines, big investigations, all of which were unsatisfactory in their speed of resolution, but also in being able to resolve them. And TWA 800, we still don't know what happened to TWA 800. It disappeared out of the sky. Most people think it was hit by something, but the official reason, I still think, is that it had a malfunction of its fuel cell or something like that.
And with the events of 9/11, what happened just after 9/11 was extraordinarily astonishing to me, which is, if you remember, American skies were completely shut down. There was no air traffic whatsoever. The only planes allowed to fly during those 2 days, September 11th to September 13th, were planes carrying the bin Laden family and members of the Royal House of Saud. And I wrote about this in House of Bush, House of Saud. But, to me, the FBI should have been interrogating these.
They really were very involved. The documents that were recently released by the Biden White House certainly point in that direction. And if I remember correctly, the royal family were, at least a representative of theirs, was at the White House the day after the 9/11 attacks with George Bush.
Meeting with President Bush on the 13th, and clearly they got a waiver from the White House to let these planes fly.
All of these are amongst, and I think about my career in news, certainly TWA and these embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. These were bold, big terror attacks that really captured the imagination of what terror could mean to the United States and what its mindset could mean to America. And really, the world hasn't gotten any better since they started with those. We've had a constant escalation of these terror attacks. Our security posture has gotten worse and worse throughout all these years. We have been under these kind of terror attacks since the early 90s, and it's been consistent since then. To have this guy, McGonigal, involved in every single one of these key investigations, and then to see now that he is open to bribery and corruption on a scale which is quite large, makes you question whether the FBI has been doing the right kind of work all along in counterintelligence, especially in the New York.
And as I said before, I think the fact that he was in counterintelligence is extraordinary, because when you look at the Mueller investigation, you realize they concentrated only on crimes, not on national security threats, as a counterintelligence investigation should do. So to me, it seemed clear that if Trump has laundered tens of millions of dollars from the Russian mafia, which after all is connected to Russian intelligence, and if he was bailed out again and again by Bayrock and other actors that were tied to Russia, the Russian Federation, isn't he compromised? They own him.
Yeah, they own him. But I guess if you have a cop in your pocket who's running the counterintelligence office at the FBI, and you have someone like Rod Rosenstein at the Department of Justice who's going to give you a very limited briefing around Mueller, you're feeling pretty confident that you're not going to get caught, because the FBI counterintelligence guy is giving you all the information about what's going on. And if Mueller and his special investigators were doing anything outside of the borders of just investigating the narrow Trump-Russia mandate that Rod Rosenstein gave them, no wonder they were able to feel so confident. And no wonder Trump was able to say things as outrageously as he did about go shoot people on Fifth Avenue and not be arrested, because probably the truth of it is they owned the cops, and they owned what investigation might be coming down the line at them. Plus, owned the mob.
Yes, no, it's just extraordinary. And I think what we see again and again is we have so little oversight in this country, whether now with the Republicans taking over Congress, It's just a joke. They're going to be doing everything McGonigal did all over again.
Yeah.
And not really doing anything to protect us.
Yeah, I don't think there's any actual or government going on right now. Now there's just like vengeance attacks to set up another really tough election for 2024. That seems to me what they're up to. There's one interesting case that I had to look up today because I didn't know anything about it. Was Wen Ho Lee, which is really the case of the Los Alamos nuclear secrets. And Wen Ho Lee was a scientist there who was wrongly accused of giving the Chinese plans to this nuclear weapon that the United States had developed. And the rush to judgment there, he spent a fair amount of time in confinement as they were trying to find ways to charge him. There was a very interesting 60 Minutes report on him, and I'll just play a short minute from that because I think it'll give us a sense of the players involved and the hysteria around what was going on at Los Alamos and the loss of these nuclear secrets.
Even though he's never been charged with a crime, Dr. Lee was fired from his job in the top secret Division X at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. He's been portrayed in newspapers across the country as a traitor.
And the truth is, I'm innocent. I have not done anything wrong with this.
Did you at any time pass any information, any U.S. nuclear secrets to the People's Republic of China?
No, I never, and I have no intention doing that.
Bill Richardson personally fired Wen Ho Lee.
That we dismissed an employee who was not following proper security procedures at the lab, who is under suspicion for security breaches.
Firstly, we know what really happened at Los Alamos now. We know that Robert Maxwell was able to get a promised software snuck into the software systems of Los Alamos, and that is how they were able to siphon the nuclear secrets out of there for China. That it wasn't, in fact, this poor guy who ended up losing his career and spending a lot of time in confinement. But it's also interesting that we see Richardson there, who, for still in a lot of people's mind, mine included, is very aligned to Jeffrey Epstein. So you've got two characters there who are suffering, and one side suffering, the other side inflicting the suffering, but both related to this Maxwell Epstein dynasty that was set up during that time. And it reminds me of how prominent and powerful the Maxwell Epstein crime machine really was. I mean, that they were able to not only infiltrate Los Alamos, get all these secrets out, them a secure place in America, unnoticed, and then also was able to practically frame this poor guy, Wen Ho Lee, who was then framed for this. And until today, I don't think there's an official record that the Maxwell promise and how we lost those secrets. And so we still don't really know what happened to Epstein either. But it seems to me that there is a criminal machine there that has never quite been brought to justice and has never quite been explained to anyone's satisfaction. And I know you wrote about Epstein as well in An American Compromise.
There's just too much corruption is the honest truth. You can't answer every single question. I've given up on that. But I do think if you go back really to the 70s and when there were crackdowns on the CIA, for example, by the Church Committee, what grew out of that was a lot of people in the CIA, also in Israeli intelligence, started doing off-the-books operations. And there was a lot of illegal arms sales to Iran going on then. There were rogue operatives everywhere selling weapons and doing off-the-books operations. And this is part of it. And Maxwell, who was a key figure in all of that, and Epstein worked with him.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. That Church Commission, which they're trying to duplicate now, by the way, which is amazing that that's their reference because the results of it was so horrific. But the Church Commission did land up clipping the wings of American intelligence operations around the world. And what happened there was they started basically assigning all these black ops to all these supposedly allied nations like Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And I guess I'll just speak bluntly about this. If your allies are out there committing crimes supposedly in your name, maybe then you need to have people in the FBI office who are not exposing those crimes because you might know that those crimes are happening. Does that make any sense? That idea that maybe McGonigal and Free and Kallstrom and Rudy were in a way covering up for operations that were being carried out perhaps in the name, or at least by the allies of the CIA in America.
Certainly, Rudy, if you look at Donald Trump's first impeachment, and essentially going back 15 years, Paul Manafort, who became Trump's manager, was essentially an operative for Deripaska and other oligarchs in Ukraine and for a Putin puppet named Yanukovych. And when after that, Putin tried other tactics and Trump was withholding, once Zelensky got fairly elected, Trump began withholding weapons from them. And that's what led to the first impeachment. Clearly, he was functioning on behalf of Vladimir Putin.
100%. I think that's absolutely true. And why it's shocking he wasn't really removed from government after that impeachment. Let me tell you a little bit more, if I may, about Mr. McGonigal's dealings in Albania, because they are really fascinating. There's a bunch of characters here on the screen. I'll explain who each of them are. The Prime Minister of Albania, the current Prime Minister of Albania, is Edi Rama. Pretty well-known guy. He's an autocrat. There's no other way really to describe him, although he's an autocrat in a democracy. So he rules with an iron fist. But the opposition party, mostly the Democratic Party in Albania, still gets 42% of the vote. So they're still very powerful. In fact, the reason that the $225,000 was given to Charles McGonigal by his friend Agron Neza, who's a former Albanian intelligence agent and close to Edi Rama, was because what they were trying to do in the United States was to get the FBI to launch an investigation into a lobbyist hired by the prime minister's opposition. So the opposition party in Albania is called the Democratic Party. They had hired a lobbyist in the United States to do some work on their behalf. In order to discredit that lobbyist, Edi Rama paid $225,000 to Charles McGonigal to get an investigation going into that lobbyist. In fact, there was an investigation. The guy was cleared. This was while the guy on the top there is the former energy minister, or the deputy energy minister, Dorian Duka, and a close friend of Edi Rama. And so this is where the indictment in DC takes us. So down this road of bribery of almost $250,000 that goes from the prime minister ostensibly, but really from his friend Agron Neza to Charles McGonigal in order to dirty up the Albanian opposition. Now they're obviously up in arms about all of this in Albania right now, and they're calling for Mr. Rama's resignation. None of it's going to happen probably, but it's certainly interesting that American politics or American crime investigations are having the potential of overthrowing a government in Albania right on Putin's doorstep. It's also worth mentioning that Mr. Rama is close to Mr. Putin, as one has to be. I think if you're running a government in that part of the world, Albania, right near the border of Russia, you'd have to certainly be friendly with the Russians. But up until now, they've been mostly Western focused and Western facing since they got independence in 1991. Charles McGonigal, along with his friend Agron Neza, who we just saw from the previous slide, a friend of the prime minister, started a company called the Law Office and Investigation Office. It's a company in Albania. In fact, they didn't start it. They bought 75% of that company from a guy named Shevket Distari. Shevket Distari is a prominent lawyer in that part of the world and also the owner of an oil company that was involved in bidding for some oil fields that they have up for auction, as they do in some countries every year or so. And the fourth partner in this company was Mark Thomas Rossini, another former FBI agent who has been previously charged for trying to bribe a government official in Puerto Rico. You've got two former FBI guys involved in this company, and this is the first that the American public is hearing of this. I've not heard this reported in the United States, but here's the actual paperwork where we can see that these four are in partnership together in this company they had started, plus the $225,000 that had been invested or given to Mr. McGonigal actually had a purpose. They were going to be paying for oil concessions that the Albanian government was putting up for auction. Just to explain the concessions a little bit, Mr. Rama's government, I'll pull up Mr. Rama again, had already had a bid out to auction a bunch of oil fields. They had already given it to somebody prominent, but then that someone prominent was discovered to have ties to Russia, so they canceled that bid, and then they did another auction. The oil auction that they were bidding on was awarded to Mr. Shevket Distari because it was his company, Transoil, that landed up winning the bid for this particular oil field. So one assumes Charles McGonigal would have benefited from that, Agron Neza would have benefited from that, and Mark Thomas Rossini, as partners in one of these firms, would have all benefited from this purchase of these oil fields. And here comes the kicker, and it really explains Albanian politics to you quite a lot, is that even though the first oil bid landed up being tied to the Russians, it turns out that even this oil bid, which supposedly was the clean one with Mr. Shevket Distari, was also tied to the Russians, that he had a close relationship with Gazprom and that intended to work with Gazprom all along.
And it just reminds me, and I think it is an important reminder for all of us to keep in mind, especially as we think about how Russia works in their disinformation efforts and in their destabilization efforts. They work both sides of the spectrum a lot. They have no problem that they'll have one bid, they'll work with one guy, but then on the other, they'll work with the other guy. They want to control the field and they want to control chaos. It's not so much ideological as it is to just try and get as much chaos on the ground as possible. But nevertheless, we have a case here where two ex-FBI agents, one who's just been charged with these two indictments involving bribery and corruption, was also likely involved in an Albanian purchase or an attempted purchase of this oil field that involved Gazprom. It seems like a fairly confined story to just Deripaska and company. Is actually much bigger because here he is actually working directly with, maybe not unknowingly, but still working directly with Gazprom, which is like basically working for the Kremlin. So that's a part of the story that has not yet quite been revealed by the American media, and I'm not sure why. Quite shocking when you think about the guy from the FBI who was investigating Trump Russia, working a business deal in Albania with Gazprom. That's stunning.
No, I mean, there are far too many ties between the FBI and Putin's people, and whether it's from William Sessions to Louis Freeh to McGonigal and many more. There are just too many. Rudy Giuliani, it's ridiculous.
It seems to me that whatever monitoring they do, where they expect the former agents to come clean on whatever it is they're doing once they leave the office and declare all their international dealings, is not working. And what they really need to do is make it illegal to work for. I know it's tough for a lot of these FBI agents who might have to leave and retire early. We can't have former FBI agents running around the world working for our adversaries once they leave office. It's almost too enticing a thing for them to get this payout at the end of their career and go and do this dirty work for Russia or whomever else.
And think of it from the point of view of an FBI agent who's out in the field and he sees that his former boss, William Sessions, is now making a fortune representing Semyon Mogilevich, or as Louis Freeh is doing with Prevazon. These are the people the FBI was investigating. Mogilevich was on the 10 most wanted list, and now they're defending. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. And it's hard to imagine a world where you're like someone like Louis Freeh is not calling up the investigators involved in each of these investigations and either providing direction or comment or whatever. It just shouldn't be allowed that you can do that. And you mentioned Sessions. I think that there's, of all of them, the most shocking and egregious thing is that William Sessions left the FBI and then went to work for the world's #1 mobster. It's corruption on a level that really is hard to fathom. And it's a major weakness in the American law and order system.
It's amazing to me the way the bar has gone lower and lower as I've aged. When I was very young, goes back to the Eisenhower era, but President Eisenhower's chief of staff, Sherman Adams, had received a very nice overcoat as a gift, a Vicuna overcoat. And there was so much protest against it. He got it from a lobbyist, and this was seen as pay for play. And I don't know what a fancy overcoat costs these days. I can't imagine it's more than a few $1,000s. And yet today you see someone like Jared Kushner getting $2 billion. And everyone just says, oh, huh.
It's amazing. It's amazing that the lucrative side of politics and the thing that makes it attractive for people to come into politics now is the ability to use power and money to subvert the system. It's much more enticing than the other side of it, which is to go and help your fellow man and come up with some good governing policies.
The scandal, the congressman became, an oil lobbyist or went into, which happens all the time, of course. But now we see, even in the sacred FBI, that they're actually working for the bad guys.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This Thomas Rossini guy that we just showed you, the other FBI agents involved in this deal around the Albanian oil field. I found this clip of his on Albanian TV. Here he is talking about the oil bid that failed, but he's also talking about a tweet that he sent out, which helped frame the Democratic Party opponents of the existing government in Albania. So he sent out this tweet. Think about it. Albania is the last country on the Adriatic to join the EU, which is the goal of Merkel and Rama, and what all Albanians want. Putin wants to destroy the EU, and Albania and EU denies his warm water port. Why is Berisha, the Democratic Party leader, Putin's puppet? Now, of course, Berisha is not Putin's puppet. This is an FBI guy getting paid by Russia to put out this disinformation on Twitter. And then he goes on television on Albanian TV and has this to say, which this is a former American FBI officer.
By staging those protests at this point in time, he's playing into Putin's hands. That's why he's a puppet, whether he knows it or not. That was my whole point of my emotional tweet. Stop. Think first what this means in the overall big picture. That's what's most important. Think about the long-term effects or ramifications of that. Not just your short-term goal of you want Mr. Rama out and you want to be prime minister or you want Mr. Bashir to be prime minister. If there's something wrong with Eddie Rama, if there's change that's needed, fine. But now is not the time. You are being a puppet of Putin. It plays into his hands by having that protest now.
They've basically got a former FBI officer doing Putin's disinformation work in a foreign country. It's appalling. And all for these concessions that he was trying to get, these oil concessions that they ultimately got from Gazprom or with Gazprom. It's the ultimate amount of cheek when you think about the work that these guys were meant to be doing.
It's also a very similar paradigm to the whole Hunter Biden case, impeachment, because there again, you have them. Biden was actually trying to help root out corruption in Ukraine. And when he was vice president, and it happened, his son was working for Burisma, and it really should have been investigated, but the Ukraine had a corrupt Putin puppet as an attorney general, and Biden was putting pressure on it.
Yeah, it's actually, I think the Hunter Biden case, there's a lot still to be uncovered that certainly deserves a real investigation. Tell us a little bit more about this brilliant book that you wrote, American Compromise. Tell people about what they can expect if they really want to read it, and why it's such a good read.
I'd like to go back to the beginning and see how all of this started. I go back all the way to 1980. And again, this was Donald Trump. He was just becoming a superstar. His very first major development, the Grand Hyatt Hotel right next to Grand Central Station, they needed, like every hotel, they needed TV sets. And somehow or other, he ended up buying them from a man named Semyon Kislin, who I'm told was a spotter agent for the KGB. And when Trump started meeting with him and bought those TV sets, he was being seen as an asset, and that was the door opener. And after Trump met several times with a woman, Dubinina, the daughter of the ambassador, first to the United Nations and then to the UN. And she started flattering Trump and saying, why don't you build a Trump Tower in Moscow? That would be great. And that was what they started dangling in front of him. And it was the KGB that actually drew up plans and sent Trump to Moscow in 1987. It was done by the KGB. According to my source, Yuri Shvitz, who was in the KGB, was major in the KGB.
Yeah, Yuri and you were on the show actually a year or so ago, and you first came out in that riveting conversation. Yuri's take is so fascinating. And then you talk a lot about the house in Miami Trump and Epstein battled over, and that Trump ultimately was overpaid for it. And that was a way to get him out of.
And then Below doubled it.
Yeah, and that's how he got out of bankruptcy back then. This was an operation to cultivate an asset. And you paint a very gripping picture in this book about how they did it. It's a fantastic read. Everyone should really read it, especially considering that this man is even considering another run. It would be shocking if he achieved it, but right now he remains the lead candidate out of all the Republicans by 17 points in the latest poll. He may just yet be the next president of the United States. I can't believe that I'm even uttering those words, but it may happen. Craig, it's so good to see you, and thank you very much for spending the hour with us. Always fantastic getting your insight into all of this and learning so much from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Zeb. I appreciate it.
Hey everybody, this little bottle contains an absolute miracle. It'll help you start your day off feeling great and with a ton of energy, even if you've had a couple of drinks the night before. Zbiotics.com/reach. You'll get 15% off.
Drinking alcohol produces a toxin called acetaldehyde. It's this toxin, not just dehydration, that causes the worst morning after effects of drinking. Using genetic engineering, we built a probiotic that breaks down acetaldehyde. We started with a natural probiotic bacteria found in a Japanese superfood called natto. Then, we altered its DNA so that it produces an enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde. This is similar to what your liver does, but our probiotic does it better. After spending a year building a prototype, we put it into a drink with this hypothesis. Before drinking alcohol, you drink our probiotic, and it works in your gut throughout the day and night, breaking down acetaldehyde and setting you up for a great next morning. Learn more at zbiotics.com.
And hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special edition of Narrative Live. It's a Thursday night. It's 9 p.m.
not normally the time I'm talking to you, but we're going to do a special show tonight looking at the McGonigal Affair. There's been a lot of research into what it means to have such a high-profile intrusion into the FBI, a senior agent for the FBI, a retired one, but still a senior one, working, it seems, on behalf of an adversary of the United States, doing some very malign things in Albania and neighboring countries of Albania. But most intriguingly for all of us, it really all ties back to 2016. We're all wondering the same thing. Did this particular agent who had his fingers on so many of the big cases of 2016, did it affect the outcome of the 2016 election? And was he already turned by the time he was working these election cases? We're going to go through all of that tonight. Now, I had Craig Unger, the very celebrated author of American Compromise, plus many other best-selling books on the other day. He writes for many of America's leading publications. And I asked him to explain a little bit more about the impact of the Charlie McGonigal arrest and indictment.
I think the fact that he was in counterintelligence is extraordinary, because when you look at the Mueller investigation, you realize they concentrated only on crimes, not on national security threats, as a counterintelligence investigation should do. So to me, it seemed clear that if Trump has laundered tens of millions of dollars to the Russian mafia, which after all is connected to Russian intelligence, and if he failed out again and again by Bayrock and other actors that were tied to Russia, the Russian Federation, isn't he compromised? They own him.
Yeah, they own him. But I guess if you have a cop in your pocket who's running the counterintelligence office at the FBI, and you have someone like Rod Rosenstein at the Department of Justice who's going to give you a very limited briefing around Mueller, you're feeling pretty confident that you're not going to get caught. The truth of it is, they owned the cops and they owned what investigation might be coming down the line at them, plus owned the mob.
Yes. No, it's just extraordinary. And I think what we see again and again is we have so little oversight in this country, whether now with the Republicans taking over Congress, it's just a joke. They're going to be doing everything McGonigal did all over again.
Indeed, it does feel like it's a bit of a joke, but it isn't. It's deadly serious what's been going on. And we're going to reveal tonight some of the things you've been asking us. Since this all broke, many people have been asking about the role that McGonigal may have played in the 2016 elections. Did he maybe have a role to play in those Clinton emails that were found on Anthony Weiner's laptop? Was he part of the cabal at the FBI that tried to convince Comey that he had to put out a statement about those emails, or they would do it themselves? Was it McGonigal who was quoted in the New York Times saying that investigating Donald Trump, this was the headline, the FBI sees no clear link to Russia? There was a lot of activity going on in the summer of 2016 involving the FBI, designed to not only discredit Hillary Clinton, but really support Donald Trump and his reputation. So those are very interesting and notable questions. We'll get to all of those tonight, but we're going to do a lot more. We're going to look at more than just those initial moments, 2016, that people have focused on in September and October. We're going to go back and look to see whether he impacted the GRU hack of the DNC, whether he and his colleagues and maybe the people who are paying his bills, did they influence the investigation? We'll be looking at the leak of those emails involving WikiLeaks, and we'll be looking at Crossfire Hurricane itself, the entire investigation. And was it compromised in any way by all this new information that we now have about McGonigal being potentially on a foreign adversary's payroll during this whole time? There's much more, of course, to the story. And what I want to do first, before we get any further, is really get us centered around the new facts that are coming out. When I look at the story being covered in the United States, it's barely getting mentioned. In Albania, it's wall-to-wall coverage because, of course, it impacts Albania. McGonigal befriended the prime minister of Albania. He was operating as an operative for him. He was doing all sorts of things for a lot of money, it seems, for the Albanian prime minister. And the extent of that is really quite shocking when you think about it. A former FBI supervising agent, charge of counterintelligence, going over to another country and operating like a mobster, basically, intimidating people, threatening people, blackmail, corruption, you name it. Those are the allegations that are being made against McGonigal right now in Albania. And most of you are probably like me thinking, where is Albania? What are we talking about here? Because it's a tiny country. It really is a tiny country. And there it sits right next to Greece, Bulgaria, and North Macedonia, just to the north of them, and then Serbia, Kosovo, and Montenegro. All of those Balkan states have a really difficult history in the last 20 years. There's lots of war going on, and that is all part of the story here. And to give you some more background here, if you could, and I can't on this map, unfortunately, zoom out, you would see that there's Romania above Bulgaria, and then there's Ukraine. And what has been so important to Vladimir Putin throughout his attack on Ukraine, throughout this crazy war that he's currently prosecuting against the Ukrainian people, was to try and build as much of a path to the warm water ports of the Mediterranean. And so Ukraine was one piece of that. It was going to give him some of those warm water ports in the Black Sea. But he certainly has indicated through his diplomatic and propaganda efforts that he has his eye out on Bulgaria and he has his eye out on Greece. In fact, he wants to go all the way to the Mediterranean. And look what happens to be there. Albania has this very nice beachfront property right along the Mediterranean. And then, of course, there was an incredible war that happened not too long ago between Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo is a newly declared independent country, but not everyone in the world recognizes it. Certainly, Vladimir Putin does not recognize it as a country. The Chinese don't recognize it as a country. So it is under contention. There's a lot of foreign and NATO and EU troops that keep the peace over there. It's quite scary that how tenuous that peace is. At any moment, it seems to people who live in that part of the world, war could break out. So when you throw operatives like the FBI, former FBI agent, into a territory like this, it could absolutely ignite a regional war of some sort. And keep that in mind as we talk through some of these incredibly difficult allegations that were made against McGonigal, the Prime Minister of Albania. There you see him pictured in his T-shirt and shorts because it is that kind of country, and he's at his beach home there. But this is as recently as a few weeks ago, him warning that Putin is constantly threatening Kosovo. Putin wants to see a war in Kosovo ignited by the Serbs. He really wants that territory back. And they supply all the oil to Serbia, which is why there is such difficulty in that area, because the rest of the guys in that area, in those Balkan countries, do not get all their oil and gas from Russia, but Serbia does. So what does that all mean? Here's the Prime Minister. I didn't get a chance for you to see him. There's Eddie Rama, the very same man that the former FBI agent, McGonigal, went to visit, became good friends with, perhaps took a $225,000 bribe, and also helped fix some other things for the Prime Minister there. This particular story alleges that McGonigal was used to blackmail Meta, the former president of Albania, when he was the president, but he did not succeed. So this is an allegation which is being made by the deputy of the Freedom Party. It's one of the biggest parties in Albania. She's claiming here that the FBI agent, meaning McGonigal, was also used to blackmail Meta, the former president. That's the allegation, that he was blackmailed. He's no longer in power. Is it maybe the reason he's no longer in power, that he was ultimately blackmailed? We don't know. But according to this person, she says other instruments were also used. There are several things that lead to President Meta. We have many other interventions. There are businessmen who have been blackmailed. There are some judges who have been blackmailed with vetting. Albania is a country which has had a lot of corruption in its history. So when you hear this word vetting, it's really all about how important it is for them to become part of the EU. And in order to become part of the EU, wants to set certain standards for its politicians, for its lawyers, for its judges. Sounds like a good idea everywhere. That's the vetting process. No one wants to not succeed in the vetting process, because you become a persona non grata in Albania. You basically can't operate in politics or business there, which is why it is so critical to understand that when McGonigal was out there blackmailing people, allegedly, he was actually influencing the political future of many of these politicians, of the judges, of the lawyers in Albania, which are, by the way, one of the big problems they've had in Albania is money laundering of the drug trade. Of which drug trade? The Sinaloa cartel drug trade. In other words, the drugs that are sold into the United States, largely by the Mexican cartel, are then washed through Albania. And that's where the Albanian mafia and the Albanian leadership makes a lot of its money. And so you can see why an FBI cop, they're blackmailing leaders, politicians, and blackmailing judges and lawyers, has an impact on whether the Sinaloa trade of drugs into the United States can continue. But these are the kind of forces that are impacting our world all the time now. And you can't just look at one instance and say, that's just isolated. Every little bit that happens in the world can trigger something else. Here's another allegation. This time, this is from a TV analyst over there who says McGonigal received millions of euros in Albania and Kosovo, and that he met businessmen, politicians, judges, and prosecutors. Now, that sounds similar to what we've said before, but it's interesting that they're also saying that these allegations continue to Kosovo, which is the country we just spoke about. Vladimir Putin is eyeing a potential war in Kosovo. And here is an FBI agent operating potentially in that country, allegedly blackmailing businessmen, politicians, judges, prosecutors, and receiving billions of dollars, according to this one guy. Now, these are allegations. They're not proven. In fact, it's very hard to even get the allegations verified because they're happening in Albania and there's not much English reporting or English news reporting coming out of there. We had reported last week in a big exclusive that does tie into all of this. We alleged in one of the narrative reports that we put out that Mr. McGonigal had found himself in a scheme involving a $300 million oil field that was being put up for auction by the Albanian government. He had become a partner with a guy named Shefket Dizdari, who's a well-known lawyer in Albania. And he's also a guy who owns one of these oil field licenses. Lucky him. It must be worth a lot of money. The other two people who own this company called the Law Office and Investigation Firm are Groneza, who's a former Albanian intelligence officer who lives in New Jersey, and also Mark Thomas Rossini, who's a former FBI agent as well. And this is the second time now we're seeing an FBI agent tied to the scheme. Now, we have confirmed that these two former FBI agents are in fact partners of this law firm called Law Office and Investigation. Here's the actual paperwork. And there's an explanation as to how McGonigal benefited and how Shefket Dizdari benefited as well from this arrangement. So there does seem to be, according to the Albanian media at least, a quid pro quo. McGonigal was approached by Dizdari to use his high position to intervene with the Prime Minister, this Prime Minister Rama, for help in the winning of oil concession. In return, they gave McGonigal a large amount of money, as well as partnership in the business, both of which were verified by CKB. It is ironic that while they were talking about how to protect Albanians from Russian influences, Dizdari himself, who introduced the American to the dance, has business ties with the Russians. So in fact, this is borne out by the indictment, which was put out by the Washington, D.C. office when they indicted Charlie McGonigal on receiving this $225,000. They said that he had been operating in Albania, that he'd met the Prime Minister, Mr. Rama, and that he actually told the Prime Minister be wary of selling those oil fields to any companies involved in Russia. Now, that sounds very good. It sounds like he's following at least American proper State Department diplomatic lines, even though he was not authorized to have the meeting, even though he never told anyone about the meeting. He never told anyone about the money. He secretly went as a former FBI agent and met with the Albanian Prime Minister and then came up with this suggestion to the Prime Minister to be careful of selling these oil auctions, these oil fields, to the Russians. Now, as it turns out, they did stop a sale of one of these oil fields to the Russians, and they gave it to Mr. Shefket Dizdari, from which Charles McGonigal and his other partners would have benefited from that deal. What Charles McGonigal didn't know at the time is that his partner, Shefket Dizdari, was also in business with the Russians, with Gazprom, as we mentioned before, which means here you've got a former FBI supervising agent in charge of counterintelligence in the New York office who, at the time that this was all happening, had still been there and was now making a deal to benefit from the sale of an Albanian oil field to a company that was sanctioned by the American state because it was owned by Russia. And you can let that sink in for a minute. There's a lot of information I just shared with you. But the allegations against Mr. McGonigal are vast and wide. And they're not just about receiving $225,000 to dirty up a lobbyist on behalf of the Prime Minister. It's much, much more than there could, in fact, be millions and millions of dollars at play here. And we know that the allegations that have now been made include that there was potential blackmailing of politicians, presidents, lawyers, judges, you name it, that he may have been involved in this $300 million Kremlin oil scheme to get the Albanian oil fields into the hands of the Russians, away from other people. And also that bribery and corruption seems to have extended beyond just the immediate region. So we're not just talking about Albania. Looking at the map again here, we know that he went on his various trips to that region. He went to Kosovo, Montenegro, parts of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So this is remarkably fresh stuff. It needs some time for people to sink into it, but this is not yet been charged as espionage, although it sure seems to me that it's an organized taking orders from someone who is not, Mr. Rama is a Western-leaning leader. He certainly supports America, but it's certainly not following American policy. And because he was doing all these things that benefited Russia, And because there are allegations that later on, he also took a lot of money once he had retired from Oleg Deripaska for additional work to remove sanctions, it sure gives you the impression that Oleg Deripaska, who acts as an agent of Vladimir Putin, was basically giving orders to this FBI guy to destabilize the region, to win some of these oil fields, and to corrupt the political process inside an independent country. Have you ever heard of anything so ridiculous? An FBI supervising agent going into these other countries, operating like a operative of Oleg Deripaska and Vladimir Putin, and causing a lot of political damage along the way. Let's get back to another clip from last week. This is when I was talking to Craig Unger, who wrote the book American Compromise, and so many other books like House of Bush, House of Saud. These are terrific books that really help you place all these stories in history. I spoke to Craig about the office, the New York field office, where Charlie McGonigal worked. The time that Charles McGonigal spent in the FBI really tracks the whole emergence of the Russian mob in New York and also the United States. We had the Cosa Nostra there before that, and then the Russian mob came in with the refuseniks, and then with that mob emerging, there was new leadership in the FBI and in New York City, and that leadership was essentially Rudy Giuliani. And he was the guy in charge, at least in the mayor's office, but before that at the attorney general's office, for policing this change that happened from the Cosa Nostra into the more Russian-controlled New York's mob scene. He had a very good collaborator because James Kallstrom was the head of the New York City FBI field office. And we know that Kallstrom and Rudy had a long history of working together, even after they both left their respective offices. They worked as part of a consultancy together, and they also always kept an open ear to what was going on in the FBI field office by being involved in the FBI union, which is where they were able to get a lot of influence and get a lot of information.
And Kallstrom was very close to Trump as well. I've seen outtakes of him on video explaining his relationship with Trump. I quote him in my last book, American Compromise, and he said that Trump, who was famously cheap about giving to charities back in the 70s, gave $1.3 million from his favorite charity. Kallstrom said Trump would call him at least once a week for a 40-year period. That's a real friendship.
And it seems that Charles McGonigal, way back in 1996, began his career as an officer in that mob world, really looking at Russian counterintelligence in New York City. A long time that he must be familiar with a lot of the same players who are still there today.
When I first got into investigating the money laundering going through Trump Tower of the Russian mafia money, to be honest, I got FBI files. And I think if I can get FBI files, the FBI should have been able to get them too.
If you have any questions on the YouTube chat, let's answer them if we can. Is the Albanian prime minister being investigated? It's an interesting question that you're asking there. As far as I know, he's been hiding for the last 4 days or 5 days, ever since this has come out. He's refused to come out and talk to anybody. But there is an attempt to get him to come and talk to the parliament there. You know, Albania is a fairly new democracy, a difficult time sometimes enforcing its democratic rules. Certainly they'd like to talk to him. I don't know if they've been able to. That might still be happening. McGonigal must have gotten away with more dollars than that is what is being reported in the paper. What can you compare against what he's ever saying was involved in? It looks to me like it was millions of dollars, although it's hard to say exactly what. The $225,000 is all he's been charged with. But it's a small amount of money compared to the values of all these other things that he was involved in. These oil fields were $300 million. And as you saw alleged there, there is an attempt by somebody there to say that there were millions of dollars involved in the scheme. We were talking from a few minutes ago there about the New York field office, which is where Charlie McGonigal began his career. And he was there with Jim Kallstrom, the very good friend of Rudy Giuliani, Louis Freeh, who was the director of the FBI at the time. All these people have allegations of being corrupt. I suppose is the only way to really describe what they've been doing. I'm talking about particularly Rudy Giuliani, James Kallstrom, who's now deceased, and Louis Freeh. They're in retirement. They've made a lot of money, and it's always a questionable thing about how a civil servant suddenly becomes so rich once they leave office, and perhaps this is why they were able to make so much money. But in 1996, things were changing in New York. The Cosa Nostra were being pushed away, and the Russian mob was beginning to start taking over the city. And to a large extent, it may have been the reason that so many people involved in the policing of 1996 had such illustrious careers. As that mob was being driven out, a lot of these characters, Andrew McCabe was working the mob scene. in New York City in 1996. Charlie McGonigal was working the New York mob scene in 1996. Louis Bledel, you might be asking who that guy is. Let me tell you who that guy is, because he also shows up in the current allegations around Albania. And this would be FBI officer number 3, if you're counting, involved in some way or another with the corruption going on, or alleged corruption going on in Albania. Here's where that little bit comes in. In one of the indictments, it says that on March 4th, 2018, this is after Charlie McGonigal's retirement, a defendant, McGonigal, dined in Washington, D.C. with, among others, Person A, the Prime Minister of Albania. And Person A, by the way, was this Mr. Nezo that we introduced you to earlier. The Prime Minister of Albania we've just been speaking about is Edi Rama, and a former FBI special agent who was working on at an international professional services firm. Now, we know that not long after this particular event of this dinner, the professional services firm, which is Ernst & Young, received a big contract from the Albanian government, an anti-corruption contract from the Albanian government. And it's Louis Bledel, who was working as the main person at Ernst & Young, who was benefiting from this particular contract. In fact, the Prime Minister even called out Bledel's name when he made the announcement that he was awarding Ernst & Young the anti-corruption contract. So who is Louis Bledel? He is the guy who preceded Charles McGonigal as the supervising agent in charge of counterintelligence in the New York field office. Not just any role, that's a pretty significant role. But on October 12, 2015, is when Jim Comey appointed Louis Bledel to that position of special agent in charge of the counterintelligence division of the New York field office. Prior to that, Mr. Bledel was in Washington, D.C., where he served as the chief of the Counterproliferation Center. So that would have put him in headquarters and also working counterintelligence and counterespionage. It puts him basically in the same zone as Charles McGonigal was before he moved to the new job of counterintelligence in New York City, because McGonigal before that was also in Washington, D.C., working on cyber counterintelligence. All these people in the same zone. Also, it's important to note that Mr. Bledel started off in 1996, just like Mr. McGonigal started their careers at the New York field office in 1996. These are pretty stunning and unusual things to learn, that these people started at the same place at the same time as Rudy Giuliani and Jim Kallstrom was there. You've really got to spend some time thinking about that. So that's officer number 3 that we now have entangled in potentially this corruption. Now, it doesn't appear to me like Bledel is going to get charged. I think maybe he's pled, maybe there's a secret plea deal, maybe he's flipped. I don't know. So we're not looking at another person being charged, but he was close enough to the action. And there's another police officer involved. Now, this is not someone who's mentioned in the indictments, but it is someone who prosecutors put in their initial subpoena to the grand jury. And his name is Thomas Fitzgerald, former FBI officer, agent as well. Also worked for the New York Police Department. I don't know very much about him and how he's tied into this, and he may not be tied into this, but I did take a look at what's called the Guardian Consulting, and look at the uplift there in the amount of money that he was able to suddenly generate in 2019 to 2021 when all of this was happening. $2.8 million from what was an average of about $180,000 before. So Tom Fitzgerald's company suddenly had a big boost of money as a lot of this action was happening, to the tune of $3 million. That could be an indication that he was involved. Maybe he was involved and he's flipped. Who knows? But that is agent number 4. 4 former Federal Bureau of Investigation agents involved in what appears to be a scheme targeting Albania and the neighboring countries there, at the behest potentially of influences or operators out of Russia, potentially under the behest or at the behest of Oleg Deripaska and his company. Who knows if it went all the way to Putin. And so let's get back to the second of those agents, and then I might leave it for tonight because there's so much more, but I don't know if we can get to all of it tonight. There's Mark Thomas Rossini. Mark Thomas Rossini was recently charged and pled, although he said he was innocent, I think he took a plea saying that he was involved in bribing the governor of Puerto Rico, which is a small-ish kind of corruption piece, but it still nevertheless is a piece of corruption you don't want to get involved with if you're a former FBI agent. But he had to turn himself into cops. He says he's innocent, but I think he took a plea deal. What's interesting about that is Mr. Rossini also at the time apparently worked for a company controlled by Walter Soriano. Walter Soriano is a British-Israeli businessman. He has ties in many places, and he's a very controversial figure. And I'm pausing very carefully as I'm saying each word about him because he's very litigious. There is a massive lawsuit currently underway in Britain targeting a friend of this show's for his reporting about Mr. Soriano, in which he alleges a bunch of things, which I will tell you about in just a few minutes. But Mr. Soriano is quite the character, and he also is allegedly tied to Oleg Deripaska. So we're wondering if Mr. Soriano, even though he's not mentioned in this current indictment around what's going on in Albania or around Charlie McGonigal, is it possible that as a operative who works closely with Oleg Deripaska, and as someone who apparently or allegedly previously employed Mark Thomas Rossini, is it possible that there's some connection between Walter Soriano and Charles McGonigal? I haven't seen these slides a couple. Here's the Mark Thomas Rossini slide. And there you see Walter Soriano and why he turned himself in Puerto Rico to face those criminal charges. And a little blurb here about Walter Soriano. Born 1967, he's a British-Israeli businessman. He's a CEO and owner of several companies, including USG Security. That's the company that Mark Thomas Rossini allegedly worked for him. And a UK-based firm specializing in the litigation support, crisis management, and asset tracing. Interesting guy. As I mentioned, he is involved in this very complicated lawsuit that he's targeting a American journalist in a British court. And what this particular journalist, Scott Stedman, has done is ask Mr. Rossini to testify. And in fact, I believe that he did testify, if I'm not mistaken, but I haven't got that testimony in front of me. All I know is that, and this is reading from the legal brief that was submitted to the British court, so there's certainly nothing wrong with doing this. In this new proceeding, Rossini likely possesses additional unique evidence that will aid the petitioner's defense in the English defamation case. Rossini's tenure at USG spanned years and covered some of the most critical events described in the petitioner's articles. Events Soriano denies ever occurred. Rossini, a USG contractor, also likely possesses contracts, unpayable contracts, or pay stubs. It says here, Forensics News' articles also describe Soriano's connections to Dmitry Rybolovlev, another oligarch and one of the wealthiest people in Russia. Forensic News reported that Rybolovlev hired Soriano to assist with multiple legal disputes in and around 2016, including one dispute with Swiss banker and art dealer Yves Bouvier. Forensic News detailed Soriano's connection to the high-ranking Israeli government officials and intelligence officers. For instance, Forensic News reported, based in part on a 2018 Israeli news expose, that Soriano had been confidant of former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for decades. Forensic News also reported, based on testimony from July 2019, an Israeli court proceeding, that Soriano had once claimed Netanyahu was a partner in USG. And, in addition, these direct ties to Netanyahu, Forensic News reported that Soriano had business relationships with Isaac Moho, Netanyahu's long confidant and attorney. These are not allegations that we are confirming. I don't know if any of this is true or not, but these are the stuff that Forensic News has reported. More importantly, it's the stuff that is now sitting in an official court document in Britain related to this court case, and they have restated all these findings in an official court document, which we are quoting there. There are other people that confirm what is out there about Mr. Soriano. Here, in this particular article, someone from BB's office said, we nicknamed him the Thug. He did things for Netanyahu. He's a friend of Netanyahu. On his Facebook page, the Prime Minister is obliged to deny, claiming not to have met Walter Soriano for 8 years. In fact, that's what Bibi says. Bibi says he doesn't know, or hasn't seen Walter Soriano for a long time. Maybe that's true. Who knows? It could be true. It's certainly interesting that he's denying all these things. There is a lot more to the Walter Soriano piece of this, and we're going to get to that at a later stage. But for tonight, perhaps the two takeaways that are necessary to walk away with are that there are not one, but potentially four, and maybe even more former FBI agents who found themselves entangled in what was potentially a squad of former FBI agents operating for Oleg Deripaska and perhaps the Russian state, who knows, it could be, operating in Albania as operatives of another country. And the allegations are vast and wide, and they include things like blackmail, bribery, falsely investigating people in the United States for crimes they didn't commit, and then also very critically being involved in this potential oil field deal, which would have netted hundreds of millions of dollars. This does lead you to many questions because, even Mr. Bladell's involvement and Mr. McGonigal's involvement in 2016 was so important that you want to go and ask these important questions about 2016. So people are saying online here that Comey needs his comeuppance. Is that the word? There's a lot that Jim Comey needs to talk about. I was watching with great interest his July press conference, which is the first time he came out about emails. And there are 6 or 7 instances where the FBI is trying to prosecute Hillary or Trump or someone in the summer of 2016. And it's absolutely a mess every time the FBI gets involved. What was that firing 2 days before retirement? I know which one you're talking about. Oh, McCabe firing 2 days before? Well, it's a good question. If it's about McCabe, again, he was one of the people involved in the counterintelligence investigation that was started in D.C. He and Peter Strzok were involved in that. We'll get into that next time. That's why Rudy went after the mafia for the Russian mob. They brought him the mid-90s. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. In the 1990s, Rudy went after the Cosa Nostra. Some people say maybe he was involved in some of the attacks on people like Castellano. Certainly Donald Trump was involved with the takedown of Fat Tony Salerno. These are all important names because that set the whole of New York's crime scene in a different direction. And, in fact, look at where it's led us. Deripaska and Manafort and McGonigal we touched on that. No, we haven't, but thank you so much for bringing it up because, of course, Deripaska was Manafort's man, not just in the Trump campaign, but also in Ukraine and also in some of these other smaller countries. I think he operated in Montenegro with Kalimnik, the GRU asset. The connection between Paul Manafort and all of this is very close. Manafort is a dirty tricks guy. He's a dirty ops guy. And a lot of the stuff they were doing was stuff like that. But it's interesting to note that even earlier on, Manafort also operated in places like Montenegro, maybe even in Albania too. It's a very small, compact part of the world. Not a lot of people live there, but it's very important geopolitically. There will be more about Manafort coming out as we work through some of the impact of the 2016 FBI decisions and why it took them so long to get some of these investigations going, why it spent months and months before they really turned to Papadopoulos and to the Steele dossier tonight. I'm going to leave you with just an interesting thought from Robert Mueller. Have a great Thursday night. We shall see you again next week on Narrative. Here is Robert Mueller.
As alleged by the grand jury in an indictment, Russian intelligence officers, who were part of the Russian military, launched a concerted attack on our political system. The indictment alleges that they used sophisticated cyber techniques to hack into computers and networks used by the Clinton campaign. They stole private information and then released that information through...
You too can become... Hey everybody, this little bottle contains an absolute miracle. It'll help you start your day off feeling great and with a ton of energy, even if you've had a couple of drinks the night before. zbiotics.com/reach. You'll get 15% off. Hey everyone, welcome to Narrative Live. We're so grateful you're with us tonight. Over the last few weeks, we've been at the forefront of the coverage of the McGonigal Affair, the biggest FBI spy scandal in history. This is the story of a supervising counterintelligence agent who lands up working for a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, and also turns out to be freelancing on the side as a dirty tricks operative for the Albanian prime minister, shaking down politicians, creating crime, corrupting democracies, and making a lot of money along the way, it seems. McGonigal has been arraigned on charges of not disclosing information. But our research has led us to believe that McGonigal's actions were far more serious, potentially a part of an effort to destabilize the Balkans, disrupt its fledgling democracies, and perhaps allow Vladimir Putin to reignite the Serbian war. 2 weeks ago, we revealed there were as many as 4 former federal agents involved in the McGonigal Affair, including McGonigal. And last week, we took a closer look at the cases he was assigned in the last 2 years he served at the Bureau. These were 2 years where the Bureau had arguably its most important cases ever, the Trump-Russia case and the Hillary emails case. The overarching concern? Could a former FBI agent who landed up on an oligarch's payroll have impacted the investigation into 2016? Over the last few weeks, we've assessed this spy scandal as the biggest in decades in the FBI history. Now we believe it's the biggest in the history of the FBI. It may even be the biggest spy scandal in the history of the United States. With that, let's welcome Eric Garland back to the show, futurist, a best-selling author, and the host of Game Theory. How are you, Eric? It's good to see you again. Thanks for joining us in the special edition.
Glad to be back. And yeah, it sounds pretty bad when you put it that way.
I noticed that the mainstream media who have been trying to avoid it actually landed up doing some service to it over the weekend and also this evening, which is good to see that there is some attempts to put it back into the limelight here. This is I believe, a fundamentally huge story that is going to really shape the FBI going forward. Because their argument is, just to give them a point of purview here, is that they say, hey, we're the guys who caught him. We're the guys who investigated him. We're the guys who indicted him with these 2 strong indictments. That doesn't work for me so much, because what if there's more that you didn't catch or you don't want us to see? And that's where it gets into tonight's show, which we'll look at the various aspects from Steele to Wiener and to see whether those cases were impacted.
The breadth of this scandal is what makes it. And it brings us back to a year that is getting further away, but that we still need to cover, which is 2016.
Right.
Some of this goes back to 2012. Some of it goes back to 1912, actually. But on a day when the Fulton County, Georgia special grand jury just reported and said, hey, the election was clean, but the witnesses were dirty.
Yeah.
So that the entourage around Donald Trump messing with the 2020 election, it looks like the prosecutions are just happening. But we're still dealing with how Trump got in office to begin with, which seemed to have quite a bit of support from the FBI, which is not what they're supposed to be doing. Back to 2016 we go.
It's ideal that both of us are here to do this tonight, because we were among the 2 who first stumbled on the Trump-Russia story in 2016 and put it out there in our different ways. You had that incredible tweet that is now, according to the New York Times, the number 14th most impactful tweet of all time. Wow, Eric, that's pretty big. Well done on that.
Such an honor. It's almost as good as the Pulitzer.
It's pretty good. I got to say, even better than the Pulitzer. It does put you in a prime position to really assess of when we sat there in 2016 looking at this potential crisis. Did you think any of the years that followed that, with Mueller and with the FBI and everyone else trying to investigate this particular case, I was always frustrated by the efforts of the Department of Justice and the FBI to come anywhere near close solving this? I just felt like, what's going on? Why are they missing so much?
That is a lot of why I came out so early with that thread on Twitter and in a fairly complete form about what was going on, because I was so alarmed by the inaction. I have a lot of contacts around the world and quite a few in the US government. And I've been doing intelligence for 25 years now, and I have people that know things. And so when something like super alarming, like Queens mobster becomes president and states that we didn't think we're going to go that direction, went that direction, we start calling around and asking, all right, so what's going on? And the most alarming thing was not, this guy Trump's connected to all this stuff. He's got this son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is coming with him. It was, I'm not sure what's going on. What do you mean you don't know what's going on? Nobody knows what's going on. That's big. What do you mean nobody knows what's going on? And basically, there are a lot of people who were panicking, but now I realize there were a lot of people who were in on it. And so the inaction was the strategic point, I think.
I think so. And as we'll discover tonight, the constant spotlight on her emails was also very much a strategic effort, I think, on behalf of both the FBI and others, which is very troubling. We should tell people, why would we think that this is even a reason to go back to 2016? Clearly, McGonigal was on the payroll of Oleg Deripaska, who's a key player in 2016. And therefore, just you want to go back and just take a look to see if there was any damage caused by the guy who lands up on the payroll of Putin's favorite oligarch. But also, he was directly involved in 2016. I'm not sure people have quite landed on this notion that Charles McGonigal was the guy who received the tip that launched Crossfire Hurricane. He was on the receiving end at headquarters when the Papadopoulos claimed that there were thousands of emails being held by Russia that were going to be used to help Donald Trump. It landed up on McGonigal's desk. And that's where Crossfire Hurricane, the big investigation at the FBI, came from. So that's not nothing. That's the origin of the biggest investigation in FBI history, one would think, or close to, excluding January 6th. And then at the same time, we think it landed on his desk because he was also responsible for investigating the GRU hack of the DNC, which in his portfolio as the section chief in charge of cyber counterintelligence in DC, that investigation, I think, fell under his purview as well, though I can't confirm that part completely. It does seem to make sense, which is why the tip that came from Papadopoulos landed up on his desk as well. So you've got two big aspects of the Trump-Russia probe that were probably under his purview before he even got to the New York field office, when he was at FBI headquarters as the section chief of cyber counterintelligence. I think that's enough to say, hey, we should go back and look at all those investigations, because it's our democracy, it's our judicial system, it's our Federal Bureau of Investigations. If there's anything wrong in there, we better find out before this happens again.
It's hard to imagine anything worse. And I think you referred to him as a supervisory agent. The place he ended up as the head of counterintelligence in the New York office, which is perhaps more important with the Washington field office for being the most important place for analysis of Russian counterintelligence, because primarily of the Russian mafia being so close in Brooklyn, but also the United Nations being there, and it being just America's largest and most important city. And he rose to head of counterintelligence there, which would have meant he had access to countless of the highest clearance requiring secrets that we have. He would have known the identities of all our various moles, all our various sources. He'd know the progress of all kinds of investigations. And to find out that once he was placed into that high position, the same month that somebody at FBI was feeding the aforementioned New York Times false information about Trump and Russia. And let me just go back and highlight that while you get the smirk about the 14th most important tweet, it was once again a negative frame about me and my revelations of that day. It was like, I think the comments were, it's proof that baby boomers will believe anything they read on the internet. I was like, or it was an outline of the Mueller report 2.5 years in advance.
Or you should believe everything the New York Times says about you anyhow.
They're in no position to be chucking rocks here, because the month that this McGonigal guy ascends to that position at FBI, they run a story saying investigating Trump, they find no connections to Russia, which is like investigating ocean. They found no connections to moisture. It's not to say that he's only connected to Russia. He has lots of dirty connections, but you got a couple of Russia contacts there.
You know what? We're going to dive right into that timeline, is because that's a big part of what we'll do tonight. Is just look at that timeline throughout July all the way through November, and the number of times that you find Jim Comey intervening and or the FBI commenting to the New York Times, or it becomes very clear in hindsight that the level of intervention was completely inappropriate, but actually fundamentally changed the course of the elections, I believe, 2016.
In October of 2016, that's when Comey puts McGonigal at the top of counterintelligence. And then like immediately after, the guy goes gallivanting off to Albania and the Balkans and all these terrible places doing terrible things. So it could be Comey is not our homie.
It could be. This chart is really interesting because this is the 4 actual former federal agents that are connected to the McGonigal affair in different ways. 2 of them have not been charged. Mark Thomas Rossini has been charged in a different case in Puerto Rico, but I suspect he's flipped. But Louis Bladel is an interesting guy because he is the guy who preceded Charles McGonigal in the post of the special agent in charge of counterintelligence in the New York field office. So everything that was going on up until Charles McGonigal is also tainted by the scandal, because Louis Bladel, when he was working at Ernst & Young later on, went to dinner with the Albanian prime minister and Charles McGonigal and got a deal from the Albanian government for Ernst & Young. So there's even more, not as direct corruption as there was in McGonigal's case, but there's another former federal agent who had the senior job, who, according to these indictments, was also being lured by the Albanian prime minister and whatever former intelligence agents he had with him. We'll talk a little bit more on the other side of this. Hey, everybody, it's Zev from Narrative. This is the most romantic week of the year. And you know what that means? Dinners, dates, drinks, and more. And sometimes those celebrations can leave you feeling a little worse for wear the next morning. I have discovered an absolutely brilliant solution for that. It's called Z-Biotics. It's a pre-alcohol probiotic, and it's a miracle formula that allows you to have a few drinks at night without getting those awful post-drinking blues the next day. No need to worry about safety. It's all natural and FDA compliant. You can get Z-Biotics for 15% off your first order with my code REACH, R-E-A-C-H. I recommend getting the 6-pack. That's what I got, and it's a great deal, and you'll have a couple of extra to share with your friends. Click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen right now and use code REACH, R-E-A-C-H at checkout. Go to zbiotics.com/reach and get 15% off, plus 100% money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied. Make this date night one even Cupid would be proud of. Get some Z-Biotics today so you can still feel the love tomorrow. I like that. Indeed, it's a good product. I highly recommend it, although I don't really drink, but don't tell anyone that.
See,
it's funny. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking, we're talking about lethal spies, and by the way, here's a hangover cure. It links up for a lot of our audience. Probably.
Sometimes this stuff does drive you to drink. Not in my case right now, but it's true. There's been moments in the last few years where oh my gosh, I need a drink. So
the great comedian Patton Oswalt did a great bit where he's talking about what happened after Trump got elected. He goes, you could hear the sound of all those AA, Alcoholics Anonymous chips, like being spun across a pond, like see you in 4 years.
I mean, for sure, it was a dramatic moment. Let's look at this timeline. There's George Papadopoulos in April 26th of 2016. And he's letting it be known that from Professor Mifsud, is his name? Joseph
Mifsud. Maltese. Mifsud.
Yeah. He gets this tip. He gets this tip from Mifsud that there's Russians are ready to help with thousands of emails that they've got from Hillary Clinton, and they would love to help the Trump campaign with that. This time Papadopoulos was already a member of the advisory council to Donald Trump. And he shares that information with Alex Downer, who's the Australian High Commissioner to London at the time, which is like their ambassador to London. And he tells him, hey, listen, these Russians are going to help us with all this dirt. That's crazy and amazing. Alex Downer tells his government. The government goes to the legal attaché of an American embassy. Legal attaché takes down the notes and identifies that the tip needs to go to, firstly, they check with the Philadelphia Office Counterintelligence Department because that's where their contact were. But that guy at the counterintelligence department said, hey, take it up to this section chief in Washington, D.C., Charles McGonigal. And that is how we got to the point where Mr. McGonigal became the recipient of that first tip. Now, well, you might think, hey, that's really, what's wrong with that? That sounds like a legitimate chain of events. And it might be. It might just be that's fine and that there's no connection between McGonigal and Papadopoulos. It's interesting to me that Papadopoulos was identified by the Mueller investigation as potentially being an Israeli agent. Now, Robert Mueller never went there. He never said he is. Papadopoulos himself said that Mueller was investigating his Israeli ties, not his Russian ties. Maybe he's an agent. Maybe he was an agent. Who knows? Maybe he's an agent for the Israelis. And then it would be interesting if he called up and landed up this, if that tip was an Israeli agent generated tip that was fed into the Australian High Commissioner and then fed all the way into Charles McGonigal. That's interesting to me because it did suddenly become the reason to have an investigation.
Actually, this is just occurring to me. There's a couple things. First of all, that the tip went to the Philadelphia field office for counterintelligence is weird because why did they have jurisdiction?
They didn't really. The person who made the call, the legal attaché who made the call, just had a contact there, and she thought, well, let me call them and figure out where the GRU case has landed, because no, they weren't clear where the GRU case has landed.
That can happen. Look, I live in St. Louis, if you happen to know anybody downtown here and go, hey, where would this guy learn about this thing with this Armenian guy came? Which way do I go? And they go, Seattle or whatever. That would be okay. If they have some special deal over there, I got some questions. But here's the thing. And this points to some of the weaknesses here. If it's FBI counterintelligence's job to know a guy like George Papadopoulos starts working for a political campaign, whether or not he's working as an agent, a witting agent on task for foreign power. If they knew that he had a chance of being that, they don't prosecute those guys. The point is not to prosecute. Prosecution is a huge problem in counterintelligence because you have to give up sources and methods. You have to do disclosure to the defense attorneys. It's a mess. Also, a lot of the actions they may be taking might not necessarily cross clearly a boundary for felony that you can nail them on.
Yeah.
What they do is neutralize. They figure out some way to get rid of this guy, tell him that they know who he is, pull his source of money, they neutralize a guy and get him off the campaign. And that probably happens in every campaign at the presidential level, that there's somebody who's working, maybe they're an intern, maybe they're the campaign manager, and they get convinced to exit stage left. But somehow Papadopoulos, they were all allowed to just run the Trump campaign with minimal interference.
They really were. That's a really good point you're making, that Manafort was allowed to survive for quite some time. It was only until the New York Times published the ledger from Ukraine that he was suddenly exposed. But we all knew beforehand where his origins came from. We always knew who he worked for. So the FBI did stay away from interfering in these campaigns, at least internally, but in the public space, they kept interfering because
that's the point. It's
Yeah.
like they were not hands off with starting off these investigations of Hillary's emails. They're going a few days before the election. They had no fear of letting everybody know that they were involved looking over the presidential election in terms of the candidates. But they seem to have been very light-fingered when it came to all the operatives around. There were many.
Yeah, the entire
In
campaign
both
was.
campaigns.
Yeah,
in both
yeah.
campaigns, thank you.
That's true. So you get to May, and then there's a hack of the DNC. What do they retrieve? They retrieve emails that they then are threatening to release through WikiLeaks. Then July 5th, there were so many email cases. I had to go back and write this down because the first case that she was using a home server to basically keep her State Department emails. Apparently a big deal. Comey shows up on July 5th with this incredibly long, I won't play it this time, played it last week, long speech about how she didn't commit any crimes, but boy, it's bad, and she should be so careless, and it's really naughty, naughty Hillary. So it leaves a mark in your brain that, hey, this isn't really cleared up. It's just like they're not charging her, but they don't like what she did.
I challenge any American over a certain age to go back in time and tell me one thing that Bob Mueller, Louis Freeh, William Sessions, any of the prior FBI directors said during a campaign, ever. And go poll the American people on how many people know who the FBI director is at any given time. Like nobody. And typically they keep their lips zipped. And also at the director level, to be involved in an investigation like that, directors of that's an agency, 35,000 special agents, 15,000 analysts, offices all over the world. The director is directing like change management. The future of the capabilities of the agency are going to be.
Yep.
They're not down going, what kind of computer did she have? Did she have a Hewlett Packard? Did she have a Mac? No, there's 40 levels of people down beneath that. So that what strikes me, this whole pattern is it's interesting. It always comes back to this group of guys that all know each other from the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
In New York.
Funny you should mention that.
So
that's because this whole group of guys, I didn't include Comey there, but this is the class of 96, I think. Basically, you've got James Kallstrom's New York FBI office that, and you all know James Kallstrom is very close to Rudy Giuliani, very close to Donald Trump.
I was class of 96, but this one is more notorious.
Yeah. And now look at the guys that showed up there. There's quite a lot of people. Louis Freeh, who later on becomes very wealthy somehow. Even Rudy became very wealthy. And so we know that Rudy and Trump kept in touch with these guys through the FBI union. When they were no longer in their positions of power, they supported the FBI union through very large donations. And I think Kallstrom ran the union for a long period of time. But there's a way that there's a connection between the FBI New York office, which seemed to outlive their time in office. Interesting.
I thought we as the American taxpayers covered their pensions and their...
Yeah, the union is the union. It does. It is interesting that all these people landed up knowing each other from back then, and they were all covering the Russian mob thing that was happening back then. So they were in Brooklyn. All these guys would have known all these characters from the mob world, from the Russian mob world ages ago. But let's get back to the timeline just to keep us moving along here. So then you've got the WikiLeaks actual email release. Wild that it happened just 3 weeks after Comey's press conference and just at the same time as they were readying to launch the Crossfire Hurricane. It just all seems so neat, doesn't it? It just makes you go, there's so much.
Can I do a little mini media rant here, though?
Yeah.
if you go back to if you go to my YouTube channel and go back to live stream that I did with the analyst Josh Faust in, I'm going to say 2010, when Manning did the first theft of data from the Pentagon and hands it to this Australian dude, Julian Assange. I'm on record there going, that's not journalism. And everyone came out and they're like, oh, there was maybe a war crime here. It's like, no, Pentagon hard drives are not journalism. Then 3 years later, this dude from the NSA walks out of Hawaii, flies to Hong Kong, and then flies to Moscow. And the media just covers it. Oh my God, this is journalism. And I'm on record going, it's not journalism. It is not journalism. But everyone's like, no, this is how journalism is done. These people were just telling us the story. And then all of a sudden, and then 2016 comes up 3 years late after that. And therein basically intervening on behalf of Donald Trump. And the media kept still taking them seriously and not revisiting.
The media have a lot to answer for. Even this timeline itself, it was breathlessly covered by the media, and they still do it today. I've only seen one major story on McGonigal since it started on the mainstream media. There are things they love, and there are things they don't love. This is one of those things they did love, and they covered it a lot. Now, I just went and highlighted the word email here because it's the same chart, but boy, look at all the emails that were floating around. This is clearly an attempt to make the emails for Hillary Clinton an issue throughout the entire campaign, even though she was cleared in July 5th. Everything is email related. There is so much to talk about Donald Trump and Russia, but all they can talk about is emails for some reason.
If I want compromise on someone, do you know what I want?
What?
The bank records.
Yes, not the
Show me the bank transfers. Show me the money offshore. Show me the names of the LLCs, and I will give you those people.
Yeah.
But there's an email, and maybe they used Comic Sans font, or they used super 20-point type. Is really bad.
Yeah, it's really, and the thing is, the emails were negligible, not that interesting after all. Anyhow, as we found out, but it didn't stop Jim Comey from coming out on October the 30th and to say, oh my gosh, I have more email news for you, because the Wiener laptop, we found some emails that were backed up from Hillary's hard drive, and now it's in the last week before the elections, and we're just going to spend the next week obsessing about this with you guys and then clear it on November 6th. And this timeline is even more suspect than the previous one. And let me put up October for you here, and you can get a sense of how insane this last month was. You had October the 4th, McGonigal arrives, or at least is announced as a new job at the New York field office. Then October the 7th, the Clinton campaign puts out their pussy tape. And then the Trump campaign, or at least WikiLeaks, responds with the Clinton email dump right afterwards, and is able to retrieve the narrative. So it was like a 1-2 punch, but hey, look who did it. It was the WikiLeaks who ended up responding so quickly. Then there's the second debate. And I think I have a clip here of October 9th. He's talking about her emails and about the FBI and her emails. Listen to this very carefully.
I didn't think I'd say this, but I'm going to say it. And I hate to say it. But if I win, I am going to instruct my Attorney General to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation, because there has never been so many lies, so much deception. There has never been anything like it. And we're going to have a special prosecutor. When I speak, I go out and speak. The people of this country are furious. In my opinion, the people that have been long-term workers at the FBI are furious. There has never been anything like this, where emails and you get a subpoena.
Long-term workers at the FBI get a special mention in the October 9th press debate because they're so upset about the emails that Hillary Clinton is supposedly acid washing or whatever it was she was doing. What are the chances are that he's not concerned about the long-term workers at the FBI? He is plain out just dog whistling to them and saying, go guys, I think. Why else would you mention the long-term workers at the FBI?
I don't know. No, first of all, again, there's so many, if you rolled the tape longer, maybe he unsaid that. Or
he said it. I think he was.
No, I said it. But
yeah.
You know what I mean? He heard the track on that. But does that sound like the story about Trump once he became president was like, he's an idiot. He says a lot of stuff that they would make fun of him for being an idiot on, that I think is him winking at various groups of people. For example, you remember when COVID comes out and he's doing these press conferences with the scientist guys, and there's a lot of propaganda about Bill Gates being somehow behind the COVID stuff. And he's like, maybe you could just get a light and you shove it in somewhere and that'll take care of the COVID. And everyone laughs about that. And then you find out that there are patented technologies to kill viruses of that type with a certain frequency of UV light. So it turns out that's not that stupid, but maybe people don't know that. Maybe somebody's commercializing one of those technologies in order to make money off this. And that's look, this guy was around the mafia his whole life. The real serious power player, they threaten your life with 3 words. That thing over there. That's his native dialect.
Yeah.
Is just saying 3, your cousin. And so he would do that so that, that he name checks the FBI. There's those long-termers that like, I know who you are.
Yeah.
I know you guys. I know
what you guys are doing for me, maybe, because the next few weeks rolls out a process of pre-billing for the James Comey Wiener laptop reveal. Go ahead.
I was just thinking that's also around the time that he would have been receiving candidate briefings. So he would have been receiving top secret briefings around that time.
Yep.
So he might have been in a position to wink at a few folks.
Every minute of Narratives reporting, every story that we break is made possible by our patrons. You too can become a patron by joining at patreon.com/narrative.
Narrative, where truth lives.
Hey everybody, this little bottle contains an absolute miracle. It'll help you start your day off feeling great and with a ton of energy, even if you've had a couple of drinks the night before. Zbiotics.com/reach. You'll get 15% off. October the 25th, out comes Lara Trump, and she's on Fox and Friends saying, there's an October surprise coming, everybody. There's an October surprise, and it's just a few days towards the end of October. Rudy Giuliani, the next day on Fox, says, I think he, meaning Trump, got a surprise or two that you're going to hear about in the next few days. I'm talking about some pretty big surprises. And then Eric Prince on Breitbart says, with Steve Bannon, and the NYPD and the FBI had forced FBI Director Jim Comey to release the emails or they would go public with their revelations. So even he's talking about a rogue FBI forcing the FBI director's hand and forcing him to then ultimately release this crazy letter that he does. And there's a series of things that happens between October 28th and November 6th, which are quite stunning. The thing on the very left is the first letter where he says, hey, we have to reopen the case because maybe some of these emails on Wiener's laptop are relevant to the Hillary Clinton investigation, which, by the way, they had known weeks earlier were not relevant at all because they'd already done the check of the metadata. They already knew that it wasn't relevant. They were just doing extra checking over this period of time. And then the next day or 2 days later, this shows up that they got a warrant to look at all these emails. And in that article, I'll just throw it up for you just so you know I'm not making things up here. I think I showed it to you earlier. But it says here that some of Mrs. Aberdeen's emails passed through Ms. Clinton's private server, officials said, which means there is a high likelihood that the FBI has already read them. Apparently, it's pretty much well known that they had been already read, that they knew exactly what was similar in her emails versus the one that are on the laptop. And then it also says in this next paragraph, they said it was possible that the review would turn up nothing, but said investigators felt obligated to check it. Really? By what? By whom? They knew it was a backup of her BlackBerry. It wasn't like, ooh, surprise.
And there's a program that you can run a comparison of those two data sets that takes about 2.2 seconds.
Yeah. Yes. Which apparently took a long time for the FBI to build.
Who investigated this again? Who was the one who did the interview?
Strzok. So Peter Strzok, who is one of these.
Oh, I know exactly.
Yeah.
Zeb, I know exactly who he is.
You do know who he is.
Because Pete, I don't know if the audience ever heard this, but Pete Strzok interviewed me in 2011. I debriefed with him over being targeted by the Op Ghost Stories Russian agents.
That's that was the.
They refer to Anna Chapman because
Anna Chapman.
she was the pretty redhead. But I had the guy, Don Heathfield, aka Andrei Bezhrikov, who was the guy operating out of Boston, who they made The Americans TV show on FX and whatnot. So it was a very interesting case. And I had a lovely chat with Special Agent Strzok.
So you know the guy.
But it was about Russian spies.
Yeah,
and so
that was his beat.
that was his beat. So that was like totally kosher. But why was he the guy on the emails?
They decided
they have a cyber division.
They have a cyber
It's not
division.
the espionage division. It's not counter espionage.
That's a good question, which I still don't understand exactly what was going on at headquarters. And the Horowitz investigation, which was the internal investigation into what happened during this time, is not clear on some of the stuff. You can see, if you read it, and I had to reread it again, it dodges some really important facts. And one of them is, where does McGonigal go? Like he gets the tip and then he disappears. No one consults with him about anything. There's no more. He's just gone from this report. And it's weird because he's still the cyber counterintelligence guy at HQ. Why is he not being consulted by Comey and everybody else? Because that's who they turn to. They turn to all the other people like Strzok and everyone, and Strzok ended up being the chief guy on the story. I don't want to cast any aspersions against these guys who are not being questioned and who are not part of this McGonigal thing, but Strzok is an interesting character. It's bizarre to me, frankly, that they couldn't come up with a case they put up against Donald Trump about him being connected to the Russian mob,
Yeah, you'd think you'd have started with Felix Sater, or Vyacheslav Ivankov, or
the condos that all these Russians owned in these buildings.
You mean, how? It's funny. They did the Trump-Russia thing, and nobody covered Dmitry Robovlev paying double for Trump's house in 2000.
No, they didn't cover a lot. And I'm glad you actually mentioned that, because there was actually a very good dossier. Some would say it wasn't well put together, but there was a dossier available of all the things that Donald Trump did that were not so good in the past 30 years related to Russia. And they didn't really cover it. The Steele dossier did show up at headquarters. There was a time when McCabe and Orr, who was the conduit to Christopher Steele, they set up a meeting with McCabe. They had a meeting, but everyone at headquarters once kept downplaying Orr's role. Meanwhile, Orr was quite a sophisticated and connected guy when it comes to Russian counterintelligence. He worked at the Department of Justice, and he was Christopher Steele's big connection. In fact, they were trying to, at the time, convince Oleg Deripaska to to basically come to the American side. So the Steele dossier and its chain of possession, if you like, goes from Christopher Steele to Bruce Orr. Then Bruce Orr meets with Andrew McCabe, tells him about Christopher Steele, gives him all this good information, and then gets to Peter Strzok. Peter apparently had already seen the copy of this thing, but nobody does anything about it. So they have this dossier, which is full of really robust information that they then end up ignoring in lieu of this one tip from Papadopoulos and their existing investigation, which was to track people like Flynn and Papadopoulos and Manafort.
I'm pretty sure it was in the application for Page's FISA, which was probably.
Yes. But that was, other than that, if you read these fine documents here, this is in the internal report from the I. There's a lot of comments in here that they met, that it was March 18th. Orr told us that he recalled only meeting with McCabe once concerning the Steele information. Once, really? Lisa Page was also present. Orr told us that he informed McCabe and Lisa Page about his background with Steele and the reporting Steele provided him. He stated he had told them that Steele and Simpson were hired by a private party to provide opposition research, but said he could not recall whether he specifically mentioned the Clinton campaign. Orr thought he also shared with them that Steele and Simpson were communicating with the others and that their information was generated for a political client and not for the U.S. government. And then also says that although Orr told us that he believed Steele and Simpson were communicating with the media, he said he could not recall whether he specifically mentioned that to McCabe and Lisa Page. That's just important for what comes up later on. But, it's just interesting that, and it does also declare in the second pink part here that he did provide Steele's previous employment background and talked about the issues concerning Russian oligarch one, which is Oleg Deripaska, the same guy that
McGonigal.
Sometimes I just can't get it. The same guy that he goes and works for, which is interesting. He goes and works for the same guy that Steele was connected to and Steele knew. But generally speaking, there are very nice things said about Christopher Steele in all of these, that he was quite good, actually. Imagine that. His material was solid, that he created all these he had lots of good sourcing, and he spoke to he knew all the right oligarchs. He was well suited to this particular job. And yet publicly, Steele was like roasted by everybody. There's no ways that he's treated awfully. Even Orr was sidelined by everybody. You had this guy who previously worked at MI6 or MI5. He was the head of the Russian
MI6.
desks. Yeah.
He was the top of the top desk in basically the top intelligence agency in the world. So.
Yeah. And he gets sidelined by these guys who are good, but don't have the kind of depth that he has in Russia, and basically just gets ignored. And then the absolute stunner for me is this paragraph. We found that the first time the Crossfire Hurricane team accessed Steele's Delta file was in November 2016. The supervisory intel analyst told us that someone was in contact with someone beginning in September and relied on him for information about Steele. Expressed surprise that the Crossfire Hurricane team did not access Steele's Delta file earlier. He said that the team should have turned that file upside down looking for information 2 months earlier, and that he assumed that some members of the team had thoroughly reviewed the file. Now, that doesn't seem right to me. I'm not a cop. I don't get this, but here's a dossier full of information about your biggest suspect. Here's the guy who's giving it to you, but you're not going back to check the history with the FBI?
I have a new thesis that's based on some of what you're talking about here. Of course, I've gone through the dossier with a very critical eye, as speaking as a professional analyst, in how the fonts are, how the writing style is, and based on some of the predicate that the two main subsources were this young man Igor Danchenko, a Ukrainian/Russian national who basically looked like a Russian intelligence agent, and Chuck Dolan, who's a former Clinton administration guy who was at the top of a PR agency that represented the Kremlin. Catch him. But there's so much duplicity going on here. And BuzzFeed was the one that publishes what they call is the dossier. If Steele really was on Team Good Guy here, or at least writing material that is well sourced and is up to the standards that one expects in an intelligence context, I'm wondering if what the BuzzFeed people put out as the Steele dossier, was that even the Steele dossier?
I think it was. I think that's generally believed to be a version of it. It might not have been. This thing felt to me like it was a live.
Hold on. Stop right there.
Yeah.
It might have been a version of it. Then who edited it? Because when you're talking about like hack and leak stuff, you put some in that's fake, you leave some in that's real, and you take some out that says something other than what you want here. Because when they talk about the Steele's work product went into a FISA warrant, that what they published in BuzzFeed just didn't strike me as professional intelligence analytic work. But what if it's not, and if it's a hack and leak job of its own, maybe the stuff that went into some of these FISA reports was up to snuff, did have the standards one would expect of explaining some of the sourcing on that, so that you could assume, look, FBI people and intelligence people, they have organized ways to communicate the credibility and history of credibility of each source. You can keep them anonymous, but you actually have ways you get a report card as a source, right?
They were sitting on this for 2 months. They're sitting on this dossier for 2 months without really checking. They did try apparently, but according to the Senate Intelligence Committee, not very convincingly, they did try to check some of these sources. But it doesn't seem to me like they were like in it. They were like, oh, let's wave a Steele off and let's see if we can chase down some of these sources. This is a highly credible agent with connections to all the oligarchs. This is not someone who's you would doubt necessarily. Maybe he could have been compromised, but the fact that they didn't even do a good enough job, a sufficient job in terms of vetting the documents. I mean, sure, some of it could have landed up in the FISA warrants, but it's not his fault that it wasn't vetted. It's their fault that they should have vetted it. It's he came to them with tips, and they didn't follow up on them.
And in terms of motive here, let's say that he's one of the world's reigning experts in Russian counterintelligence, which he is, and which he was, and still is. Maybe there's somebody today who's LeBron, but he's Michael Jordan. This is top of the heap here. Let's say he's watching the discussion of Russia stuff, and like his hair's on fire, going, "That is not what is happening." And then he puts a dossier together and hands it over to the right people, and they screw around with it because, look, these are from the rest of the McGonigal story. I think the least we can say is these guys were screwing around with things they were not supposed to be doing. That one I feel really confident about. Meeting with Albanian intelligence while you're on the payroll of the United States and work for FBI counterintelligence. Nope.
Yeah, you just don't do that.
Against rules.
But also, if your colleagues at MI6 or your former colleague at MI6 arrives, and this is someone that you previously has helped you connect to other oligarchs. He's been the intermediary in the past for the FBI. Like, you wouldn't just say, ignore the guy or toss him to the side. You would actually say, oh, this guy's got credibility here. He's got a history here. He knows all these people personally. Let's give him a shot here to see what he's got to say. Where they landed up sidelining him, not paying him after they saying they would. And he got totally scared and want to come back to the United States for a while. He did speak to George Stephanopoulos of ABC News. And sometimes it's just helpful to see what they say and the expressions on their face themselves. I think it speaks volumes for who he is. Hey, everybody, it's Zev from Narrative. This is the most romantic week of the year. And you know what that means? Dinners, dates, drinks, and more. And sometimes those celebrations can leave you feeling a little worse for wear the next morning, if you know what I mean. Well, I have discovered an absolutely brilliant solution for that. It's called Z-Biotics. It's a pre-alcohol probiotic, and it's a miracle formula that allows you to have a few drinks at night without getting those awful post-drinking blues the next day. No need to worry about safety. It's all natural and FDA compliant. You can get Z-Biotics for 15% off your first order with my code REACH, R-E-A-C-H. I recommend getting the 6-pack. That's what I got, and it's a great deal, and you'll have a couple of extra to share with your friends. Click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen right now and use code REACH, R-E-A-C-H at checkout. Go to zbiotics.com/reach and get 15% off, plus 100% money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied. Make this date night one even Cupid would be proud of. Get some Z-Biotics today so you can still feel the love tomorrow. I like that.
Give me a declarative sentence. Christopher Steele is
a patriot who has professional integrity and expertise, and somebody who is a true friend and ally of the United States.
Steele authored the infamous Steele dossier. It presented some allegations about Russian interference which proved to be accurate, but others, including a salacious claim that the Russians may have had a video of Trump watching prostitutes in a Moscow hotel room, are either unproven or discredited. An investigation by the Justice Department's Inspector General showed that the source who gave Steele some of his key material, a Washington analyst, told the FBI much of it was rumor and speculation, including the supposed videotape recorded by Russia to blackmail Trump, what's known in Russia as compromat.
One of your main collectors spoke to the Inspector General, said that especially the compromat was word of mouth and hearsay, conversations with friends over beers. It was just talk.
If you have a confidential source and that confidential source is blown or is uncovered, that confidential source will often take fright and try and downplay and underestimate what they've said and done. And I think that's probably what happened here.
Yeah, they're dead.
Yeah, it's the Russians. You're not going to screw around with that. They fall out of windows and all sorts of things happen to them. You would be careful. And in this case, it makes sense to me that either these guys weren't the sources, because he knows all these people personally. He doesn't need to go to some guy in Virginia to be his source. He knows Oleg Deripaska. He knows him. It's not that hard to get information from the source. You wouldn't need to do all this stuff.
So my background is not signals intelligence. I wasn't like a naval technical guy, and I didn't work at the NSA. My background is human intelligence and developing networks and doing so over long periods of time. This is apples to apples comparison. If you've been doing something on a singular topic like that, where for over 2 decades, where you were under what's known as official cover, where you're working as a diplomat out of the embassy so that you can get out and develop sources like on the ground in Moscow, which is, by the way, hands down, not close, the most demanding, difficult,
I'm sure,
professional human intelligence gig that there is in the whole game. And he was there in the 80s doing that. And from what it looks like from his family background, like he was born in Yemen and his mom and dad were working for the meteorological service. When he was born in Yemen, I'm like, that's a spy family. I'm just guessing. Maybe they're super awesome meteorologists as well, but that's very exotic. It just says MI6. But anyways, then he rises through the ranks back at the main office and ends up as the head of all counter Russian intelligence. Over the course of that period of time, you would know you'd know people personally, but you would be evaluating the dossiers put together by all of your network of analysts all over the world And you would be in the position at that height, at the head like that, with that kind of top secret access, you've got access to who the sources are. That's what, when you go secret, top secret, sensitive compartment information, and then code word stuff, the further you get down into the fine code words and super controlled information, the super controlled part is, okay, who's the guy who told us this? That's the stuff they protect, because if you don't protect it, people end up dead and you got problems.
And he's protecting his sources. Of course he is. Sorry.
But he would also, yes, as a native response, but also he would not only have had his own personal sources that he could go out for a beer with or take a walk in the park with, he would have seen dossiers with hundreds to thousands of sensitive sources. And then we're to believe that the documents we saw from BuzzFeed and then the Inspector General's report, which I got some questions about now that you bring it up.
Too. Gonna look at that.
He asked the guy in Alexandria, I'm like, you're in London, you're friends with oligarchs, and you're literally should know the names of thousands of sensitive sources. And you go to Igor and Chuck in DC.
There are so many oligarchs living in London. The Russian scene there is pretty big. He does not need to go to someone in Virginia for any sourcing here. So that just is it can't be accurate. It just cannot be accurate. That's where he could have probably spouted off all that stuff on his own as his own source before needing to go to any of these other two. That just doesn't strike me as being real.
What if BuzzFeed was a front for foreign intelligence, which I think it is? What if BuzzFeed was a front for foreign intelligence trying to besmirch his actual work?
Could be. Or
they did a pretty damn good job.
Oh, yeah, they could. Look, if you think about it, if you go back, you have Papadopoulos potentially sending up this concern around the Russians supporting Hillary with the emails. At the same time, there's a competing strain of evidence coming towards them, which is the Steele dossier. If you're wanting one to be more successful at launching the Trump-Russia investigation, you would discredit Steele and you would support Papadopoulos, right? And that's, from a narrative perspective, that's what you would do. And you'd get that to be the impetus for a foreign intelligence investigation by the FBI. I've got a few minutes left here. This is going to be a little long, but I'm going to read it to you anyhow, because it is fascinating, because it puts you in another mindset. This comes from my story that I wrote about Oleg Deripaska a while ago, but I'll read it as quickly as I can, and I'll get to the stuff that's really the most interesting. In 2014, the Justice Department began a documented 2-year effort to recruit Deripaska as an informant as part of Operation Outreach. Intriguingly, it was former MI6 spy Christopher Steele, the famous author of the dossier, who approached DOJ to suggest potentially flipping Deripaska. So that's just an interesting note. That's how far back that connection goes. It wasn't the first time Deripaska worked with the FBI. In 2009, the FBI enlisted the oligarch for an attempted rescue of Bob Levinson, the American-held hostage in Iran. The mission didn't succeed, but Deripaska got enough information out of the Iranians to get what he wanted out of the deal, a legal U.S. visa. The recent effort to flip Deripaska began in earnest in September 2015. The Justice Department, Bruce Orr, met Deripaska to ask about Putin's ties to organized crime. Deripaska has reportedly rebuffed the advance, but by the beginning of 2016, the oligarch's rehabilitation was underway. We know this because the FBI helped Deripaska get another U.S. visa in February 2016. The oligarch was encouraged by the softening of the agency's stance, according to emails released by the Republican lawmakers. We reckon that forthcoming OVD, that's Deripaska, contact represents a good opportunity for the U.S. government. That's what Steele texted to Orr at the time. Keep in mind, this is all happening at the same time that Christopher Steele was writing his dossier. As it turns out, Steele had worked for Deripaska in 2012. While it's unclear if the two men were in direct contact, Deripaska was sending Steele messages through his U.S. lobbyist, Adam Waldman. Was Steele working for Deripaska? No one can say for sure, but FBI Director Christopher Wray refused to discuss it in an unclassified setting when Tom Cotton asked him of this. Later in February, Deripaska was the subject of a U.S. interagency meeting. Prior to that meeting, Steele shared sensitive documents which showed Putin was exerting pressure on the oligarchs and that Deripaska was not a tool, according to Steele. And then contacts between Steele, Deripaska, Waldman, and Orr continued almost all the way up until the election. The last contact was in September 2016. This is great. When Orr and Steele showed up unannounced at Deripaska's New York apartment. We think Russia is colluding with the Trump campaign, and we think Manafort is the key guy, a knowledgeable source told David Ignatius of the Washington Post. According to the source, Deripaska responded, "I hate Manafort and I'm suing him." And we know at the time that was true, that he was doing that, but it was also possibly an artful dodge, because we know that Deripaska through Kalimnik was working with Manafort and getting all these updates. My point there is, the guys that are actually trying to stop all this, the guys that are going to talk to Deripaska and challenge him on this, are Steele and Orr. They're not Strzok and whomever at headquarters. In September 2016, these were the guys going confronting Oleg Deripaska.
And the Trump-Russia story, about maybe, I don't know, he gets a hotel, okay, but the real killer story in all of that is they hand the Republican National Committee, like, polling from that year, they hand that to a Russian spy who takes it back to Russia. Now, there's a whole bunch of the international interference in the American election that year. Some of it's Malaysian. A bunch of it's Saudi. A ton of it's Israeli.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Chinese stuff. But there was definitely Russian stuff too. And that is the real stuff. That would be the smoking gun, if you will, is not they control him because he got into some water sports with some prostitutes one time, blah, blah, blah. That is the damning stuff between the Trump campaign and Russia, as they took the prize jewels of the Republican National Committee polling and handed it to Kalimnik, who apparently had the skill set to know what the precinct by precinct data meant, which means he was a specialist in this. So that's the real stuff. And it sounds like that is what Steele was focusing on.
And both of those got sidelined, and Strzok gets a book deal and doesn't achieve very much out of the Operation Crossfire Hurricane. That didn't land anywhere, didn't actually achieve anything. Comey gets a book deal. Comey gets several books, actually, gets to go on TV and be a famous guy. Meanwhile, he was the guy inflaming all of this throughout the entire summer, talking about her emails. And that's
don't forget the Showtime movie.
Yeah. Oh, and the Showtime movie, making him look like a god. There's a lot of questions.
Oh, and him stroking his chin. It's so tough, and there's so many people at FBI who don't like her, and I'm just this really good guy. And
it's clear that there's a lot more that needs to be looked at here. And I know the FBI is desperately trying to avoid this, but you can't. It's here. This story is massive, in my opinion. And the more I look at it, the more angles it has and the more disturbing aspects there are, that this could be a fairly widespread issue for them in headquarters. And maybe some of those people are gone now, but maybe they're not. Maybe there's others that are still there. And we need to clean the house, because if this is what they're used to doing. I don't want to go through this again in 24. I'm sure Joe Biden doesn't want to go through this in 24. I'm sure nobody does, except for maybe Donald Trump.
I'm just going quickly back through the Steele dossier, which is searchable, and it doesn't get into the real Manafort.
No, because that was happening almost live at the time. It's this almost at the same time that Steele and Orr would have gone and confronted Deripaska. Deripaska must have been like going to the meetings right afterwards to get the data from Kalimnik.
That was August 8th, 2016. I believe.
Yes, and they came to confront him in September.
So but in this world, that's a month. That's a long time.
It's a long time.
It's long enough to make it into the dossier. So if Steele is kicking around discussing Manafort and what he's up to, and he's got these other sources. And by the way, if Konstantin Kalimnik is running around Manhattan, you know who should be just on him all the time? It's FBI counterintelligence should have his phone tapped. And the stories that they came out with later were about how I believe Davis, his business partner, Manafort's business partner, Rick Gates, and used WhatsApp to send him to send Kalimnik the files of the
they met at
polling
the
data.
Cuban place at the top of Jared Kushner's 666, and they met. This is Rudy's haunt. It's not like it was far to find out where the Russians go and hang out with their mob friends. It's what they do.
Yeah, and this is Russian counterintelligence in New York City. These are the most obvious dudes possible. If anyone's going to get a FISA thrown on them in perpetuity, it hypothetically would be Paul Manafort, because he worked for Viktor Yanukovych.
Yeah.
So you want to know where he's at. But no one would. The media kept going, a Russian Slav sort of guy who was a florist or who really liked gymnastics, and they left out Russian military linguist, which means spy 100% of the time. This may be the average poor reader of some of these terrible media outlets we have in this country might have been fooled by that, but anybody with expertise in counterintelligence who looks at Kilimnik goes, that guy's a Russian spy. It's a campaign year. He's hanging out with the campaign manager of the presidential election. Follow him.
It's vastly
Tap
illegal.
his phone. Yeah. And so, were you telling me that Kilimnik was allowed to run around with consumer grade devices around Manhattan and upload data from the RNC and successfully send it over to Russia? And FBI counterintelligence didn't really pick up on that?
No, they did not. And in fact, the one guy who probably did, which was Steele, they weren't talking to because they weren't talking to because they decided it wasn't worth their time. So that's lots of questions right there. Hey, Eric, it's so nice to see you and hang out with you again. Tell everyone where they can see you on YouTube because you have your own shtick up there. Tell us about it.
Just go look for Eric Garland. It's this, but not with as much conversation. So.
It's very good. It's very good. It's like tight little bits that are very interesting and tell you all about the world of intelligence plus the world of intelligence and everything that's happening around the world.
You might get to my other channel that's Electric Bass. So if you want to know the secrets of the fretless bass, you've got that channel. And then if you want a teardown of how the 18 intelligence agencies work in the United States, we've got that for you too.
I highly recommend both. So thanks for being here tonight. It was really great to hang out and hopefully see you again soon. And for all of you at home, thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the Twitter feed, mine or Eric's, and keep in touch with us at patreon.com/narrative. We always appreciate your support. And we thank you very much for being here tonight. Have a good night, everybody. Hey, everybody. This little bottle contains an absolute miracle. It'll help you start your day off feeling great and with a ton of energy, even if you've had a couple of drinks the night before. Dbiotics.com/reach. You'll get 15% off.
Drinking alcohol produces a toxin called acetaldehyde. It's this toxin, not just dehydration, that causes the worst morning after effects of drinking. Using genetic engineering, we built a probiotic that breaks down acetaldehyde. We started with a natural probiotic bacteria found in a Japanese superfood called natto. Then, we altered its DNA so that it produces an enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde. This is similar to what your liver does, but our probiotic does it better. After spending a year building a prototype, we put it into a drink with this hypothesis. Before drinking alcohol, you drink our probiotic, and it works in your gut throughout the day and night, breaking down acetaldehyde and setting you up for a great next morning. Learn more at zbiotics.com.
And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. It is a late start for us tonight, and I apologize for that. That's entirely my fault, but we're here. And I'm very excited to have Jeff Stein from the incredible Spy Talk, who is, and you got such a good tagline. You were just telling me, intelligence for thinking people, I think you just said it was. Is that correct?
Yeah, we kind of like that.
That's a really good one. People may recognize you from your long and illustrious career as the guy from Newsweek who covered a lot of interesting things as a columnist. You were also at the Washington Post. And before that, you were at Congressional Quarterly, quite an illustrious career. And then you've decided to spend a lot of time these days focused entirely on the intelligence world. And you also the foreign news editor for UPI. You've been at the New Republic, the Nation, and Italy's L'Espresso. Do you speak Italian?
See, it's great to be able to just do intelligence stuff because I got into this because I was a case officer myself. I did a stint with the Army and Army intelligence. I ended up in Vietnam, but I was trained as if I were going to Berlin and to send agents behind the Iron Curtain, as we called it. So all the tradecraft stuff I learned, how to spot, recruit, and manage a spy, live undercover, invisible writing, secret photography, all that stuff. It's a boy's life, I got to tell you.
What an experience.
It was my way of getting out of the draft into the infantry. And this is during the Vietnam War, and I didn't even like camping, so I knew I'd be no good at the infantry.
So you mentioned recruiting. When you look at the case we're looking at tonight, when you look at this incredible incursion into the FBI, as it appears to me, when you look at Charlie McGonigal, do you think of him as a good candidate for recruiting? He seems to me like one of those people who'd be primed for any foreign intelligence agency to go after. I know there's an acronym people use, and you've reported in your last story called MICE. Stands for, you'll tell us, I hope, in a few seconds. But he does seem to me like he's a perfect character for that.
Yeah, you never learn that. The next day, by the way, I did an interview. I touted my own podcast interview with a fellow that talked about how he turned into he had to be a sociopath to be a case officer, which is you're looking for people's weaknesses and how to exploit their weaknesses. And that's really sociopathic kind of behavior.
It really is.
But you learn to split your mind between I'm doing this for the defense of the United States or whoever you're working for. You're a Russian case officer. You're doing exactly the same way. So you look at weaknesses you can exploit, and most people have a weakness. But guys who become defectors and play spies, they're usually their weaknesses are amplified because they're in a kind of cloistered atmosphere, being in the intelligence world for a long time, and they develop needs like most people. They need money. They're kids in college. They might feel resentment that they haven't gotten ahead as much as they thought they should have. If their bosses were dickheads, as one of my sources on McGonigal put it, that he was a dickhead because he was always screaming at his subordinates. He was always kissing up to his peers and his managers, but he screamed. They called it the McGonigal shower. Stood in front of me.
I know people like that. I've
So he
worked
had
with
this
people like that. It's no fun.
Everybody's worked for somebody like that. So he had all these resentments, and he had this incredible ego. And the FBI people don't get paid that much. The FBI is a pretty important organization, and if you're pretty highly ranked, like he was as the head of counterintelligence of the FBI, you might be thinking, I should be making a lot more money doing what I'm doing. I'm doing world-changing stuff.
Yeah, you really are in that job, especially in the years that he was working. He was right at the tip of all these world events. He probably did, we think, maybe change the course of history. But if not, he certainly had the capability of doing that.
The New York office is almost like a semi-autonomous branch of the FBI, like the prosecutors, the DOJ office from the Southern District of New York is almost like its own Justice Department. There's a lot of autonomy there. It's a very powerful audience. And if you're running counterintelligence in New York, you're really in the center of things because that's where the spies are. If they're not in Washington, they're in New York. And there's the United Nations with all its spies and counter spies and so on. And you're certainly going to know the ins and outs of your opponents. And if your opponent hasn't been indicted, like Oleg Deripaska, then,
love his name.
And he comes to you and he gives you a business opportunity, you can say, I know this guy. You can say to yourself, I know this guy is he's a Russian agent, but he's never been indicted here. He's never been charged with espionage, money laundering, all these other things he's been charged with or suspected of. And of course, Charlie McGonigal was really in a position to know this. So he knows who he's dealing with.
But he knew as well that he was critical to the 2016 influence operation. So it's not that he didn't know he was guilty. He knew he was guilty.
He knew all this stuff about Deripaska. Yeah. He knew all this stuff about him. The smell of money. You wave the smell of money in front of a guy like McGonigal who's got resentments, right? And he's got a huge ego. And so here comes somebody waving a lot of money, more money than you've ever seen before, except in money laundering cases that you might have been involved in. And you want to show your bosses that you can really pull something off in a negative way. You're almost asking to be caught. People who do this are sick little puppies. They really have got a crack in their personality. And a trained intelligence officer is trained to recognize this and draw this out over conversations over time, and then fill the need that is the gaping hole in your target's personality. Love, affection, respect. In the case of Ana Montes, the Cuban spy who was recently released, she was enraged. She was working high up in the Defense Intelligence Agency, but she was really militantly against the war in Central America, the wars in Central America. So a friend who's a Cuban asset introduces her to a Cuban who hears her out, and gives her a way to act on her hatred for the U.S. role in Central America and says, we can help you hurt the U.S. in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And you don't have to do anything else. You can just work on that. Just give us secrets about that. And she's recruited. And then, of course, they move the goalposts and say, we'd like some more and something else. Once you've taken the step across the line, they've got you, right? They can blackmail you.
I want to dig into two things.
So with Charlie McGonigal, soon as he stepped across the line, soon as he had coffee with Deripaska, and maybe Deripaska had his guys taking surveillance photos of them together, they got him.
It seems to me that it started much before he even met Deripaska officially, at least according to the timeline. He had the contact with the former consulate official, who was then a translator, I think, in Brooklyn court. And in the course of his time at the as an investigator and the special agent in charge of counterintelligence in New York, he encountered this former diplomat in the Brooklyn courts, because that's where you go and do your business sometimes. So it's not like they were strangers to each other. They knew each other. They had certainly crossed paths. And what I find so interesting is during
I'm
that
interested in that guy.
in that entire period of 2016, into the summer of 2016, the FBI was really trying to flip Deripaska. They basically handed him a visa in February of 2016 because they thought maybe if they treat him nicely and if they exchange some information with them, they'll be able to flip him. So the reason why he was even in the United States at the time of the elections or leading up to the elections was because the FBI gave him that visa. And there's no doubt that, he would have encountered Deripaska, and even perhaps in the halls there, they might have had conversations. They were debriefing him on various occasions. It would not have been surprising.
Deripaska was throwing himself at U.S. intelligence as well.
Yeah, exactly. So
he volunteered to help out on the missing FBI agent in Iran.
Exactly. So there's a whole history there
his own money
of this dance with Deripaska that was quite brilliant, really, because he not only was doing this incredible maneuver against American democracy and coordinating this attack on democracy, but at the same time, he was dangling himself as a real prospect for being someone who was going to flip. And then there's, of course, the Christopher Steele saga, where there are a lot of indications, although Christopher Steele will deny that Steele was working for Deripaska, even at the time that he was making that exact document.
A former Russian asset of the CIA came to me right after the Steele dossier. He wanted to have lunch, and I went and had lunch with him. And he said, that's bullshit, right? Steele dossier, that stinks. He said, I think that's a Russian product. And I dismissed him out of hand.
But in retrospect,
I was very suspicious. There's a lot of, what's the spy game? There's a lot of reasons to believe a lot of things.
Yeah.
Deception is always in the middle of it.
You've spoken to a lot of people who know Charlie McGonigal quite well, and you've described him as being someone with a bit of a mercurial character, someone who will blow up and has a lot of ego. That's okay. People can be like that, but still do their jobs well. But he held two jobs that you have to wonder how good or proficient he was at these jobs. If as the head of cyber counterintelligence, he basically was in charge of trying to stop the attack on democracy that the Russians were doing, the GRU attack on the DNC, the WikiLeaks stuff. And yet it wasn't really able to even hint to many people that it was actually going on. When you think about the progress made at the DNC, it was so slow and painful. That case just ticked along very slowly. The same with the email cases, the same with Wiener. These are all, the timing seemed so unfortunate all the time. Do you think that was just him being bad at his job? Do you think the Russians were really good at what they were doing? Or is he just basically under someone's
They are very good at
influence?
They are very good at this. They've been doing this a long time, even before the Soviet era. But the Bolsheviks picked up where the Tsar's agents left off. There are all these emigre anti-Bolshevik groups across Europe, and particularly in Paris in 1918, 1920. So what did the Bolsheviks do? They created their own emigre group and attracted the people to it and then rolled them all up. They're very good at this game. And McGonigal, in a way, reminds me a little bit of Kim Philby. McGonigal wasn't part of any establishment like Kim Philby was. Kim Philby went to all the right schools. He spoke the right way, bred, and he really shocked these. And people couldn't believe that he was be an agent, that he would have gone. Even when they knew he had, they couldn't really believe that Kim Philby at the top of British intelligence could be a quisling. And he was. McGonigal didn't come from that same cut, but when you're in a position like that, when you're the head of counterintelligence, you're supposed to be the top Russian hunter, right? And you're chewing your cup. People aren't going to believe that. They don't want to believe that.
No, they don't.
And I think we have a lot more to learn about Charlie McGonigal. I think the arrest was just the second round with him. The first round would have been Charlie calling him in and saying, Charlie, we got you. Let's make a deal. You cooperate and we can go easier on you. And I think his attorney said, well, maybe we'll get back to you on that. But right now, there's no deal. But I think we're going to learn a lot more. I think there's going to be some motivation on some in the FBI to leak out that McGonigal was much more engaged in espionage. He has not been charged with espionage.
I know.
But we may learn he had his finger in so much stuff. He was involved in trying to get to the bottom of why the CIA had lost so many agents in China.
This was as part of
That's classic
in
counter.
2010. There was a concern around all these spies starting to disappear in China, and he was in charge of that special task force designed to figure out exactly what that was about. And who knows whether he was leaking information during that? Who knows if he was leaking information to Deripaska as they were trying to grill him about what was going on in 2016. And then there's all this incredible stuff that happened in Albania, and I have a lot of research which I'll leave until tomorrow about what he was really getting up to in Albania. And it's very lucrative for him and also very shady, and certainly looks to me like he was operating basically as a on-the-ground field operative for the other side.
Yeah. And he was not the only ex-FBI guy involved in that mess either.
Yeah. There's at least four of them as far as I can see.
And four, yeah. And one of whom I know really quite well.
Is this Mr. Rossini?
Mr. Rossini,
Yeah.
There's a lot more to be learned about that all that stuff in Albania. I think that was probably just for money. Spying may not have been involved. But again, the thing is that once you take the step across the line, the opposition knows you've stepped and they have a handle on you. And Charlie McGonigal certainly has a longtime counterintelligence specialist. He knows better than anybody because he's practiced this as a counterintelligence agent. Get somebody across the line, get them to do one little compromising thing. I remember being trained, this is 1,000 years ago when I was trained as a case officer. And one of the maxim is you get somebody to do something that's not illegal.
Yeah.
You ask a guy to give you a document that's not classified. And you have somebody photograph that meeting where he's giving you something. Or you don't even have to have that. He knows once he's done that, you've got something on him. He's going to bed with that in the back of his head at night, or she, I should say.
So
it's one of the ways that foreign agents get a handle on congressional staffers.
So what you're describing is a longer process of recruitment, that it's not just hey, here's a bunch of money, let's get you going. That this takes a long time. It requires a building of a relationship. It requires a process of understanding the vulnerabilities of that person, what they need, what kind of needs can you fulfill, and then a slow escalation of things that you're asking them to do. So it wouldn't be in that, hey, Charlie, here's a $220,000. I'm going to give you in a bag in a parked car outside of a restaurant. It didn't start there. It must have started way earlier with, hey, can you give us a little bit of evidence about this? Can you let us know what's going on in this particular investigation? And over time, they would have built a relationship of trust, maybe a friendship. McGonigal was going through a lot of personal issues as well. He had this relationship with his girlfriend. He had his ex-wife, as he called her, although she wasn't an ex-wife in D.C. There's a lot of things going on in his life. He was nearing retirement age and had spent 20 good years in the FBI, had not seen enough. He had his
best years of his life.
Yeah. He had to give his kids through college. They were all college-age kids. That's not cheap. And so you've got a man who really is primed for this kind of stuff. Even if he knows that he's doing it, he's probably thinking, how do I get them through all of this? How do I, not excusing him, of course. I'm just saying
it must have been tempting for a long time. There would be reason for him to meet with high-level targets of the FBI, like Deripaska. There was reason for him to meet with these guys. and try to recruit them or suss them out. Get, who is this guy there, Spaka? Let me get to know him. I'm the head of counterintelligence. I'm going to handle that myself. There are lots of Russian mobsters and mobster / agents close to Putin that were of high interest to the FBI. So he can meet with these guys. He's got a reason to meet with them. And he's trying to recruit them, right, to come over. But he may be sitting there and thinking at the same time, this guy's worth $1 billion.
Yeah, several.
And Deripaska might be even kidding with him and Charlie, whenever you leave the FBI, you've got a job with me. There was a KGB guy that used to look me up all the time in Washington. And I mean, his light cover was from TASS, the Soviet news agency. And he also went after Chris Hitchens, my late great friend. And one time he invited us both out for coffee together. So Hitchens and I went to this place in DuPont Circle to have coffee with Boris, our KGB guy. And Boris is trying to get everything he can out of us, thinking we've got secrets. Actually, he just needs to write a report. So from his Washington sources, which are us, which he will parlay to Moscow as that we're his spies. But halfway through the lunch, or I guess it was drinks, Hitchens said, Boris, why don't you come work for us?
You just do that. Just throw it out there.
Just come over to our side. We could make it really comfortable for you.
Deripaska is very wealthy.
He was like
incredible lifestyle. He's surrounded by beautiful women all the time. He lives in a yacht, has these penthouses in New York, these other homes, maybe 6 or 7 of them in these beautiful locations. And this man lives an extraordinary life and has so much money at his disposal. You could see how any number of FBI agents earning, $180,000 a year, maybe, probably less, are sitting there thinking, why not? It's my one shot.
I think it was our friend Craig Unger who pointed out in a piece in the New Republic that a lot of ex-FBI guys have gone over to the bad side. Not that they became agents or spies, but they went to work for bad guys.
Yeah.
Russians, former directors of the FBI. I don't know that Louis Freeh or any of these other former directors have been called on the carpet.
I don't think so at all.
It's amazing that the FBI lets them do it.
It is amazing to me that they all do it because up until now, I guess it hasn't been that much of a problem. Up until 2016, it didn't seem like it was going to be that much of an issue. Then comes this attack on democracy, and suddenly it is a very big issue. So what might have been tradition, you leave the force, you can go take whatever job you want and get your cushy job in working for some billionaire or working as a security analyst for somebody. Cut to 2016, things change a lot. Suddenly America's under attack by these foreign agents. And you've got a situation in 2016 where the rules did change, where the whole thing was no longer acceptable. But the culture takes time to reflect that. You need cases like McGonigal to show that change happen.
They've always been trying to subvert our system for as long as I've been around. They've always tried to, but they tried very hard to make progress during the anti-Vietnam War years. They didn't really get far. The big spies that went over the other side, Ames, Hansen, all these guys, they did it for money, and they didn't do it for ideology because of Vietnam or American imperialism, blah, blah, blah. But they did it for money. Americans spy for money. Russians and the Chinese who come to us, money can be involved, and personal issues involved, but basically they're doing it for ideology. They hate the system. They hate the communist system.
Right.
Or they hate the corruption. Very ideologically driven from the other side, but Americans spy for money. That's what they want. That's what they need. That's what they crave. And they've been trying it forever, but they never had a fruitful atmosphere until Trump came along. They've been going after Trump for decades before he ran for president. His first wife's father was a Czech communist agent, and they had her reporting on Trump. He was reporting on Trump through his daughter, who was married to Trump. It's all been out there for a long time. I don't need to bore people with it, but his deal with the Miss Universe contest is going to Moscow all the time. He took out full-page ads in the New York Times and elsewhere saying he could solve the nuclear arms crisis and get reductions in arms, making a nuclear-free world. The Russians saw this, and they've been grooming him for a long time. And
tell me,
so suddenly they've got this atmosphere, and there's in American political culture has changed where there's great distrust, the rise of the Tea Party movement, and so on. American politics is fracturing in a way at the high level, which hadn't happened before. They
No.
saw their opportunity and they took it.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned Hansen there. Do you think this is the scale of Hansen? Is it bigger than Hansen? Is it going to turn out to be the biggest scandal we've had in the intelligence world in the United States? Or is it just one guy, maybe a few colleagues just meandering off in the wrong direction? What kind of scandal do you think this is going to be?
We don't know yet, but we do know that Charlie McGonigal was in a hell of a position. He was in a position like Hansen. He had a catbird seat. He saw a lot. He knew the names of our agents in Russia and China and other places. He knows their head of counterintelligence for the New York office. He knows a lot.
Yeah.
He knows code names. He knows meeting places. He knows commo systems. One of the things they were investigating in the loss of CIA agents in China was a heavy suspicion that the covert communication system with the Chinese agents had been compromised somehow. And they were looking to where was the leak on that? By the way, there had been a similar leak of CIA agents in Iran, and they were all rolled up in murder too. So this seems to be a problem. There are huge counterintelligence holes in our defenses here.
Yeah, they really are. They really are. It's remarkable that this has happened. And Charlie McGonigal, his career spanned many of the important counterintelligence, the cyber and counterintelligence roles in DC and in New York. But he also was responsible for investigations like TWA 800, the Los Alamos investigation, investigated the terrorist bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. This just and 9/11, of course, stands out as one of his key things that he was involved investigating. Those are all just very high-profile investigations. If he was leaking
And the
information,
the failures leading up to January 6th, the FBI says it was clueless. It didn't know what was really going on, if these groups were coming, if they would ransack the Capitol. As Bob Dylan wrote, you don't need a weatherman to tell you which way the wind is blowing. And that was all in the air weeks before. I remember doing some reporting on this. Social media was on fire with these right-wing groups talking about marching on Washington and taking down the government. Did he have a finger in that, in blunting the intelligence on these right-wing groups coming to Washington? The Proud Boys, the FBI had multiple confidential sources in the Proud Boys, and yet they never learned about their plans for January 6th.
Sounds ludicrous.
It makes
Sounds
you
ludicrous.
wonder,
It
as
does
they
indeed.
say. Makes you wonder.
Jeff, I want to thank you so much for taking time to be with us tonight. Jeff Stein, a columnist for Spy Talk. He's also, as many of you, pretty celebrated reporter formerly of the Washington Post and of Newsweek, Congressional Quarterly, and a bunch of other places, including Playboy, GQ, Esquire, Rolling Stones, all your favorite places, and the New Republic. Amazing stuff. Jeff, thanks for being here. I'm really enjoying your insight into his mindset and into why he was such an interesting and potent recruit for any adversary. And this is one of those stories that's going to keep going. But I thank you very much for being here tonight.
I've admired your work for some time, so I'm really pleased to be here.
Thank you very much. And likewise, do you want to tell people about your outstanding Substack and how it's a must subscribe to?
I started Spy Talk back in 2005. I was a Homeland Security editor, putting out a daily on Homeland Security at Congressional Quarterly. And that was mostly domestic stuff as a result of 9/11. And I'd always been foreign news oriented, national security oriented, the foreign side, foreign policy and so on. So I was bored. And sources were still coming to me and dropping stuff on me, or I'd read stuff that I thought needed more attention, and specialist journals and so on. So I started writing Spy Talk as a weekly column at Congressional Quarterly in 2005. And somewhere along the line, it became 3 times a week and then daily. And so I did it until late 2009, until the company was sold to the Economist Group, and they fired about 40, I think there were 45 of us. They were fired. We had a great party at my house. Anyway, we all scattered to the winds, and I ended up in the Washington Post. They hired me to do a Spy Talk blog, a daily blog. It wasn't that great. I had to file every day. I'm more of an investigative guy and not an instant wisdom guy. It went all right. It went on for a year or so. But a friend of mine became editor of the revamped Newsweek, and he called me up and said, "Hey, come over here, and you can do spy talk and whatever else you wanted to do in the national security." So I jumped there, and that was a great 7 years. And then that came under new management, and the last of us senior reporters were lopped off, and that happened to be. And shortly after that came along, and a friend of mine is an early signer up, Bill Bishop, who does the Sinocism, their China newsletter. He was hugely successful, making a lot of money. It's upset. And so he said, "You ought to come, you ought to start this column over here. This is a great outfit." So I talked to the owners and they said, "Yeah, come on over." So I started and didn't really know what to expect. I'm a little long in the tooth now. So I wasn't really ready to be banging my head against the wall every day, working 80 hours a week like I once did. But I started out as I conferred with some equally long in the tooth friends, former great journalists at places like the Post and the Times and Newsweek and so on. So the bunch of us started it together, and it's taken off. It's not up there with the big hitters like Andrew Sullivan, who do mostly political and social commentary. I'm a niche within a niche doing intelligence, but as I say, it's the subtitle is Intelligence for Thinking People, and that we live at the intersection of intelligence with foreign policy and military operations, so where they all come together. It's not the biggest thing on Substack, obviously, but it makes me a nice living, and I'm able to pay people, like my contributors who write for me, and so all's good in the world. We're having fun, and when I have somebody who worked with McGonigal call me up and say, "Let me tell you about McGonigal," that makes my day. Absolutely. I can write a story because I've known these sources for years.
And so it's called Spy Talk. There's a free version, but then, of course, they can also subscribe to the paid version. Make sure Jeff gets his coffee and gets to eat his chili. And Jeff, thank you very much for being on the show tonight. This wasn't exactly what we had planned, but Thanks, I'm glad we were able to get it done. And we'll hopefully have you back on another day and talk some more.
Me too. Thanks. It was fun.
Thanks. Every minute of Narratives reporting, every story that we break is made possible by our patrons. You too can become a patron by joining at patreon.com/narrative.
Narrative, where truth lives. One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narrative, where truth lives.